Good morning, everyone. Happy to see so many of you on a bright and sunshiny Valentine's morning. Thanks for being here. Thanks to the National Press Club for having us this morning. My name is Ted Mitchell. I'm the president of the American Council on Education, and I'm pleased to welcome those of you who are in the room and those of you who are watching on live stream. Hopefully we'll have a nice interactive session throughout the day. We're very excited to have you all here. If you've seen ACE's new strategic framework, and if you haven't, I encourage you to take a look at it on our website. You'll know that we have renewed our institutional commitment to putting equity front and center in ACE's work. At the core of our plan for the next 3 years is our vision for American society, a society that's vibrant, that's diverse, that's democratic, and importantly for those of us doing the work, relies on post-secondary education to expand knowledge, to expand equity, and to advance social progress. These are unambiguous goals for ACE. They are unambiguous goals for our membership, and I know that those goals draw you here today. Higher education is the nation's preeminent engine of economic and social mobility, with the power to improve the lives of individuals and communities. But we are falling short. Racial equity gaps in access, in completion, and postgraduate success are persistent, they are pervasive, and they're destructive to our high purpose and our commitment to that just society. These are not simple problems. The events of the last several weeks have demonstrated, again, that race is a deeply embedded construct in our national psyche, if not our national character. To address the issues of race in our institutions, we have to begin where we begin today. I know it's not fashionable, particularly in this town, but we need to begin our discussion with a deep and rigorous analysis of data and evidence. And that's what brings us together today. The report we'll be unpacking is an embodiment of ACE's commitment and our partners' commitment to developing such evidence on racial equity and inclusion, and is reflective of those strategic commitments that I mentioned a moment ago. The data that you'll hear about doesn't provide instant answers for closing equity gaps, but rather it provides the foundation upon which ACE, our partners in the field, and our institutions can ask the right questions, implement the right policies and practices, and, yes, reverse the inequities that are so persistent. That said, we will be tackling some of the answers later on today when we get to our panel discussions with several of our esteemed colleagues who are leading experts on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. That conversation will be one in which we want you to be able to participate. And we hope that the conversations in the two panels will leave tracks for us as we go back to our work and develop those policies and practices that we think can move the needle. The products today are foundational to a larger body of work that the research team and ACE are conducting on diversity, equity, and inclusion. That is to say, this may be the starting point for this longer conversation, but it is certainly not the ending point. Our focus on data, our focus on equity-minded leadership, and diversifying the leadership pipeline in higher education, something we'll talk a little bit more about, is important to us and will continue to be, so stay tuned. I also want to thank the Urban Institute and the USC Center for Race and Equity for being partners in this work and co-sponsors of today's event. As a community, we need to learn from each other. And we have been blessed with two national foundations who are committed to helping us learn from each other and with each other. We would not be here, and this work would not have been completed without the generous support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. And we're also grateful for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for their support in putting on this convening and helping us with our ongoing dissemination work. With that in mind, I want to get out of the way I'd like to invite my colleagues from Mellon and from Gates to say a couple of words. So Armando, if you wouldn't mind, coming on up, and Travis, I won't do the back and forth, so when Armando's done, it's all yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Armando Bengochea, and I'm the Senior Program Officer in Higher Education and Diversity at the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. So I want to thank Ted Mitchell and the leadership of the American Council on Education, the group of authors who collaborated on the new text, including Laurel Espinosa, who has been my principal contact at ACE since the foundation sought to support this project, Sandy Baum for her expert data collection and interpretation skills, and the staff of RTI International for their partnership in this project. The Mellon Foundation realized, perhaps later than it should have, that the predecessor publication to this report, which has all of us assembled here today, was no longer going to be published. I recall that a few of us in the higher education program at the foundation first noticed the absence of that volume, which was called Minorities in Higher Education. We first noticed its absence for updated trends somewhere around 2014 or 2015, when we were working on projects that required the authoritative information about racial and ethnic population trends and projections that only seemed available in one source in that publication. Once we realized that ACE had the project on a kind of hiatus and understood the extent to which our foundation work would be hampered without it, we began the conversations that led to this new, even more comprehensive volume, the Race and Ethnicity in Higher Education report. We were delighted to learn that, in fact, ACE had even bigger plans for this next iteration of the work, inviting scholarly essays and building a microsite that could help coalesce a community of policymakers and university professionals around the themes of the volume. The need for this data and trend analyses has never been more critical, living as we all are in an era of ever-expanding inequalities. Income and the other disparities Ted mentioned appear to widen every day, with profound implications for access to higher education. All of us in the educational and philanthropic and policy community can find in this new publication ways forward against the most difficult trends. The multiple levels in higher education and in related, the Mellon Foundation works on various fronts to help remedy the problem of underrepresentation in multiple levels in higher education and in related fields and organizations, such as in the arts, in orchestras, in academic presses, in libraries, and elsewhere. We could not be more pleased to now have this new work by ACE at the ready so that our efforts can be informed and grounded in the best data analysis possible. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning. And thank you. As a funder, I generally approach these types of events much as a parent would approach a wedding. My job is to dress up, show up, shut up, and pay up. So I appreciate the opportunity to say just a couple of words about this. First, I want to say thank you to Ted, Laurel, the entire ACE team, the authors, for focusing attention on this issue, and to Armando and his colleagues at the Mellon Foundation for supporting this work. We're very proud and grateful to be a partner in it. We at the Gates Foundation we support this work because we believe that every person deserves the chance to lead a healthy, productive life. And in the United States, we focus on education as a life-changing opportunity to help reach that goal. But we're also painfully aware of the fact that as a nation, we're not living up to our aspiration of educational opportunity for all. Today in America, a white adult is twice as likely as a Hispanic adult to have at least an associate's degree. A low-income student is 5 times less likely to have a bachelor's degree by 24 than a high-income student. This is unacceptable, and it threatens our economic and social mobility, as Ted mentioned, and our competitiveness as a nation. But we also see reason for hope. Colleges and universities of all types are confronting these opportunity gaps, and they're closing them or getting close to closing them. Institutions like Georgia State University or the University of California, Riverside, or the community colleges participating in our Completion by Design initiative who met their progress targets 3 years ahead of schedule. It's also apparent in the work of researchers like Raj Chetty and his team at Opportunity Insights, publications like the Washington Monthly, and initiatives like the University Innovation Alliance. Thanks to them, the conversation about prestige is shifting from one of who we exclude to one of whom we include, which is absolutely necessary and long overdue. This report is an essential part of our ongoing push toward a day when educational opportunity is not decided by race or income. It shines a light on the progress that's been made and the challenges ahead. Our efforts to achieve greater equity in higher education will depend in no small measure on an honest accounting of our successes and our shortcomings. I congratulate ACE on this work, and I call on the higher education community to read it carefully, think on it deeply, and act on it intentionally. Thank you.
So I want us to turn to the report itself now. Thank you, Travis. Thanks, Armando, for your support and for those great words. As we move to the report itself, I want to reiterate what both Armando and Travis have said and identify Laurel Espinosa, the Vice President for Research at ACE, and her team, who really brought this to fruition, who brought the idea to the Mellon Foundation. I couldn't be prouder, and hope that you are as well, Laurel. So over to you.
Okay, good morning. Well, it is wonderful to see everyone here today. I am so thrilled to be releasing this report. This has been months, a year and a half actually in the making, so you can imagine the joy that my team and I feel today. We had over 900 total registrants for this event. That speaks volumes to me, including those online. So let me also plug, given the online presence, a couple things. First, our hashtag, which is #EquityMatters, so let the tweeting begin. And for our online audience, please also send questions for the presenters to equityandhighered@acenet.edu. So now that that's out of the way, we'll get the conversation going online. I also want to extend my deep gratitude to the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and to Armando in particular. He really has been a wonderful thought partner in this work, and this work is very important, of course, to Mellon and to ACE. And thanks too to Travis and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for their support of today's event, which is just one of many dissemination channels that we'll be tapping into, and I'm going to say a bit more about that in a moment. I also want to thank the Urban Institute and the USC Center for Race and Equity for their co-sponsorship of today's event. So I will proceed with some more things in a moment, but I want to say that we are here and you are here because race matters. It absolutely matters in higher education. It matters in our society at large. Ted said a little bit about that. And of course, these two environments, higher education and our broader society, are intertwined in a number of important ways. And we ultimately went on this journey of producing the report and the website we will dialogue on today in an effort to provide the field with an easy-to-turn-to source of foundational evidence required to chart the course to closing racial equity gaps. Because evidence also matters, as Ted pointed out. We encourage everyone to visit the project's website, equityinhighered.org. You will find the report itself, all 300 and some odd pages of that thing, as well as downloadable chapters, data tables, figures, and a host of other resources, such as programs and initiatives working to bring awareness to and ultimately close racial equity gaps. We will release quarterly updates to this site, and we will post a host of other materials along the way, so do visit often. But back to the journey. Producing a report and a website like this takes a lot of thought partnership. We are grateful to our partner RTI International, who built the site and also helped conduct some of the analysis you see on it. We are also grateful to our senior advisor, Sandy Baum, and to the project's Research Advisory Committee that Sandy chaired. Thanks to our project's Communications Advisory Committee, and of course to members of my research team, who you'll see in a moment, and to our graduate research associates. I'm feeling like I'm accepting an award right now. But I do have deep gratitude for all these people, and there's a long list of acknowledgments in the report itself, so please look there in terms of who contributed to this expansive body of work. So I'm going to turn the mic over to my talented team who will talk about the data. Let me leave you with where we go from here before I do that. And I mentioned the site, equityinhighered.org. Visit often. Also know that we will drop a second report in 2020 covering a host of new data, in addition to some updates you'll see to the current data in the report. And above all, we are starting a conversation with you, with all of you in the room, with those online, with those who are not in either space, through the site, but also through spin-off products with the Gates Foundation's support, and we're generous, their generous support, and we're grateful. So the first is a conversation that we will have at ACE's annual meeting in Philadelphia. That's coming up here in about a month. It takes place from March 9 to 12. And on that Monday morning, I will be moderating a dialogue between Beverly Daniel Tatum, President Emerita of Spelman College and author of Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, and other conversations about race, and Robin DiAngelo, author of White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism. This is a very important conversation, and the reason I'm bringing it up here is because even if you're not able to attend the annual meeting, and I hope that you are, know that that conversation will be live streamed, so you can join us. So like I said, we're starting a conversation. We will also be soliciting issue briefs, essays, and blog posts using our data as a jumping off point, and I welcome those in the audience with ideas about what we should be writing about. Or you might be interested yourself in contributing, and I welcome that as well. Please do give us feedback on this work. This is a village in terms of what it takes to close these gaps, and I absolutely welcome your counsel on how we can do our work better. This is a part of a larger body, as Ted mentioned, on diversity, equity, and inclusion in ACE's Division of Learning and Engagement. And there we have a focus on equity-minded leadership, on institutional transformation, and on student success, and those are all requirements to close these gaps that we'll talk about today. So with that, let me turn it over to my colleague, Jonathan Turk, to start the presentation of our findings. John is our Associate Director of Research, Morgan Taylor is our Senior Research Analyst, and Holly Chessman is a Research Fellow at ACE, and we could not have accomplished this great feat without this talented group of individuals. So let me go ahead and invite John to the stage.
Let's see, get my slide to advance. Perfect. Good morning, everybody. So Laurel covered this, so I'm the quant guy on the team, so I'm going to jump right into talking about some of the data that kind of underlines this report. So, to produce this report, we analyzed data from 11 principal sources to generate over 200 race and ethnicity-based indicators. The table presented here summarizes those data sources. To explore enrollment, persistence, completion, as well as how students pay for college, as well as post-secondary faculty, we analyzed data collected by the U.S. Department of Education. To examine changing demographics in educational attainment in the U.S., as well as employment and earnings, we looked at data collected by the U.S. Census Bureau. And then finally, to help fill in some of those gaps, we brought in additional data from non-federal sources. So those would include student completion data from the National Student Clearinghouse, as well as demographic data on the college presidency from ACE's American College President Study, as well as data from the GED testing service and our colleagues at Coupa HR. So before diving into the key findings for this study, I think it's important to offer a couple of notes about the data themselves. Because this report relies mostly on secondary data, we as a research team had to make decisions about how to work with and present data that others collected. Across the 11 data sources we used in this report, there were some differences in how data on race and ethnicity were collected. As a result, data for all groups were not available for some of the indicators in the report. With that, for the vast majority of our indicators, the report uses the 8 IPEDS-based race and ethnicity categories, which includes a category for those who identify as more than one race and those who are considered non-resident aliens, whom we refer to as international students or faculty. We as a research team recognize that the language individuals and groups use to identify their race and ethnicity has changed considerably throughout the history of the United States and continues to evolve. As a result, our existing data may not accurately reflect current identities. Throughout the report, we disaggregated analyses by race and ethnicity when possible. Because much of the data used in the report are derived from complex surveys, small sample sizes precluded the inclusion of estimates for certain groups at times. This was often the case for American Indian or Alaska Natives and Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islanders. We also disaggregated many of the student-based indicators by sector of their college or university. We classified post-secondary institutions into one of 4 sectors listed here, based on the institutional control, so public, private, and for-profit, and the predominant degree granted. So while some typologies would classify a college or university that offers a few bachelor's degree programs, but predominantly awards associate degrees as a 4-year institution, this report, we classify those as 2-year institutions. Finally, it's important to note that our findings are descriptive in nature. So as a result, we do not really discuss causality in this report, and we would caution against interpreting our findings as causal. Turn over to Holly.
Thank you, John, and good morning, everyone. It's good to see you all here. We are excited to present to you some of the high-level findings of the race and ethnicity report, and so it's finding number 1. As you're probably aware, over the last 20 years, the United States population has become more educated, and it has also become more racially and ethnically diverse. The data from the census shows that almost 45% of the total population ages 25 and older had attained at least an associate's degree. This is an increase of over 13 percentage points over 1997. One of the reasons for a more educated country is that the growing Hispanic population is seeking higher education now more than 2 decades ago. An examination of the slide from the National Post-Secondary Student Aid Study in 1996 and 2016 reveal that Hispanic enrollment, highlighted by the red circle, has increased almost 10% in the last 2 decades. This is the largest increase of any other racial or ethnic group. And as you can see from the figure displayed here, Asian adults, highlighted by the red arrow, had the highest levels of educational attainment, with 31% holding a bachelor's degree, which is the light blue bar, and almost a quarter with an advanced degree, which is symbolized by the maroon, navy, and gray bars. By contrast, and despite steadily rising attainment, Hispanic men and women and American Indian or Alaskan Native men had the lowest levels of attainment, with most holding a high school credential or less. This translates to over half of American Indian or Alaskan Native men having a high school credential or less, and about 63% of Hispanic men with a high school credential or less. Additionally, African American, American Indian or Alaska Native, or Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander populations also each exhibit low college enrollment rates of traditional college-going age. When they do enroll, they represent a disproportionately older population of undergraduates. But on an encouraging note, the baccalaureate and beyond data from the Department of Education revealed that more students of color who received their bachelor's degree during the 2007-2008 were more likely to enroll in graduate school within 4 years of earning their bachelor's degree than white students.
Thank you, Holly. And good morning. All right. So looking across the data presented in this report, we saw that while Black students have made encouraging gains over the past 20 years, they continue to fare poorly in our higher education system. At both the undergraduate and graduate levels, advances in enrollment and attainment have been accompanied by some of the lowest persistence rates, highest undergraduate dropout rates, highest borrowing rates, and largest debt burdens of any racial or ethnic group. The outcomes reflected in this report show systemic and structural barriers that can limit or eliminate the opportunity for Black families, communities, as well as our nation at large. So Black students exhibited the higher rates of leaving college without completing a credential than any other racial or ethnic group across all sectors of higher education. We used data from the National Student Clearinghouse to look at 6-year outcomes for the fall 2011 cohort of students. When we look at students who enrolled exclusively full-time, the data show that over half of Black students who started at a public 2-year institution left without completing a credential. This is compared with 39% of all students. More than 1 in 5 Black students who started at a public 4-year institution had left and not earned a degree, compared with 14% of all students. And then lastly, among students who started at a private nonprofit 4-year institution, nearly 1 in 5 Black students left, compared with just 10% of all students. If we look at how undergraduate students finance their education, we see that Black students were more likely than others to receive federal grants and loans, but graduated with the largest student loan debt burdens of any group. The roughly 86% of Black bachelor's degrees recipients who had borrowed owed an average of about $34,000 at the time of graduation, compared with about $30,000 for students overall. The roughly 67% of Black associate degree recipients who borrowed owed an average of about $22,000, compared with $19,000 for all students. As the data show, patterns of borrowing among African American graduate students are deeply concerning, particularly at our for-profit institutions. In 2015-16, approximately half of all Black doctoral students were enrolled at a for-profit college. If we look among completers, about 27% of these students completed at a for-profit institution. The vast majority, 95% of Black doctoral degree recipients who attended these institutions borrowed an average amount of over $128,000 for their graduate study. As shown in the table here, that is nearly $17,000 more than Black doctoral degree recipients at public and private nonprofit 4-year institutions, and also $20,000 more than white graduates at for-profit institutions.
So while we were analyzing the data, the Department of Education data, one of the things that I found most frustrating is that we were unable to definitively illuminate some information about American Indian or Alaska Natives and Native Hawaiians or other Pacific Islanders. Much of this is due to insufficient sample size, especially related to completion rates of secondary school, graduate enrollment, and how they fund their education. This is especially concerning when we have robust data and can see some of the equity gaps in education and the labor market. When examining enrollment data for 2016, we saw that roughly 41% of persons 18 to 24 years of age were enrolled in college. This is in contrast to the roughly 20% of indigenous populations, represented by the red and light blue bars on this graph, of the same ages who were enrolled in 2016. When Native American or Alaskan Native students and Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander students were enrolled in higher education, they were less likely than other racial and ethnic groups to attend a 4-year institution, attend a selective college, or pursue a bachelor's degree. When we looked at the graduate level, we saw a higher share of indigenous students than all of other graduate students completed degrees at for-profit institutions. In the census data, we see that from that Native American or Alaskan Native students, adults highlighted by the orange box, were actually learning much less than adults who have the same degree. In 2016, they were earning between $5,000 and $27,000 less than the national median.
Okay. So we also saw that there were differences that existed by race, ethnicity, and gender in where students went to college in the fields in which they completed their credential. So when we look at the data, we see that with the exception of Asian students, larger shares of undergraduate students of color were enrolling in and completing their credentials at for-profit colleges. As shown here, about 8% of all undergraduate students were enrolled in a for-profit college. This is nearly double the share of Black undergraduates who are attending these institutions, 16%. 12% of Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander students also attended these institutions. Over half of all American Indian or Alaska Native, Hispanic, Native Hawaiian, or other Pacific Islander students were enrolled at public tier institutions compared with 46% of all students. So I'm going to turn to completions, and we see here that there are differences in what students study across racial and ethnic groups. For example, this is looking at associate degree completers. 17% of Asian students who completed their associate degree did so in a STEM field. This is double the share of Black students at just 8%. As a group, Hispanic undergraduates were among the most likely to pursue and complete an associate degree. However, as the figure in this data show, Hispanic students were the least likely among all domestic undergraduates to complete their degree in a healthcare field. Now, this is particularly important because when we look at median annual earnings across select occupational fields, healthcare fields have the largest earning gaps between high school graduates and associate degree completers, which is about $19,000.
So chapters 7 and 8 of our report explore how undergraduate and graduate students pay for higher education. So overall, our analyses revealed meaningful differences by race and ethnicity in how students pay for college. What I'll show next is just a small snapshot of what you can find in the report and on the microsite. So to gain access to federal financial aid, we know the first steps for students and their families is to complete a FAFSA. In 2016, 70% of undergraduates had submitted the application for federal aid. 84% of African Americans and 68% of undergraduates had submitted a FAFSA, the most and least of any group. Expected family contribution, or EFC, is an estimate of a student and or their family's ability to contribute to a year of post-secondary education expenses. Students with lower EFCs are eligible for more need-based aid. Almost 60% of Black undergraduates had an EFC of 0, meaning that they were the most in need. This was more than any other group. Finally, 77% of undergraduates in 2016 had received some amount of grant aid from federal, state, institutional, or private sources. On average, undergraduates received about $8,800. You can see the breakdown here for select groups. All right. Now, this slide contains borrowing rates and average debt for both associate and bachelor's degree recipients. There's a lot of information on the table, so I'd like to draw your attention to just a couple of items. So starting on the left side for associate degree recipients, 48% of completers borrowed an average of a little more than $18,500. Nearly 70% of American Indian or Alaska Native and Black associate degree recipients borrowed, with Black graduates borrowing an average of $22,300, the most of any group. To the right side of the table, bachelor's degree recipients, nearly 70% of completers borrowed an average of about $29,700. Here, nearly 90% of Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islanders and 86% of Black bachelor's degree recipients borrowed. Again, Black graduates borrowed the most at roughly $34,000, which is around $4,000 more than the all-group average. Finally, just a couple of notes on borrowing for graduate degree recipients. The data here reflect borrowing for graduate study only, not undergraduate study. The slides contain the proportion of master's, professional, and doctoral degree recipients who borrowed to fund their graduate education, as well as the group average for each degree level. What's particularly important to note here is that African American graduate degree recipients at each degree level borrowed at the highest rate. They also, on average, borrowed the most. The high borrowing rates and average debt loads for African American graduate students is to a degree a function of the type of institutions they enroll in. As Morgan mentioned, African Americans disproportionately enroll and complete their graduate degrees at for-profit institutions.
Okay, so we also looked at the racial and ethnic diversity among those who work on our college and university campuses. And while that diversity has increased over time, the demographics of our faculty, staff, and administrators still does not reflect that of our student body. All right. So when we look at the racial and ethnic diversity of full-time faculty, the data show that in 2016, people of color held only 21% of all full-time faculty positions. To put this into context, 45% of all undergraduate students and 32% of all graduate students identified as people of color. When we look at faculty rank, over 1/4 of all white and Asian full-time faculty were in full professor positions, compared with just 17% of Black and 19% of Hispanic full-time faculty. The racial and ethnic diversity among staff on campus varied greatly by position type, with larger shares of people of color serving in support staff roles. For example, when we look among leadership in chief officer roles on campus, whites represented the vast majority. As you see here, chief development and advancement officers were the least racially and ethnically diverse positions on campus, with 94% of individuals in these positions identifying as white. Among college and university administrators, chief student affairs and student life officers were the most diverse position on campus, with a little more than 1/4 identifying as a racial and ethnic group other than white. And then when we turn to professionals and support staff roles, we see that 1/3 of all campus safety and over 40% of all service and maintenance staff identify as non-white. Okay. So the racial and ethnic diversity of the college presidency has increased greatly over time. Between 1986 and 2016, the share of non-white college and university presidents more than doubled, from 8% to 17%. As the figure here shows, when we look at the intersection of gender and race and ethnicity in 2016, women of color only held 5% of all presidencies. Okay. So as Laurel mentioned before, you can find these data and more on our project's microsite at equityinhighered.org. Here you can also download the figures, the data, the full report, and individual chapters from the report. The site also contains additional resources that highlight just some of the good work being done in this space around issues related to race and ethnicity in higher education. We will be updating this site quarterly and encourage you to please frequent it often. We also encourage you to join the conversation on Twitter today using the hashtag #EquityMatters. Now we will unpack what these data mean in our first panel. What do the numbers tell us about race and ethnicity in higher education and in America? And if you would please join me in welcoming the first panel.
Okay. There will be a quiz later. So I want to welcome to the stage, to my left here, Sandy Baum. She's been named a couple times already as a senior advisor on this project. She is a non-resident fellow at the Center on Education Data and Policy at the Urban Institute. Next to her is Abram Kendi, director of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center and professor of history and international relations at American University here in Washington. And finally, Cecilia Rios Aguilar, associate dean of equity, diversity, and inclusion at the University of California, Los Angeles. So welcome to the stage with me. And what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and ask our panel here some questions that have been on my mind, that I know have been on their minds as well. And then we'll save plenty of time for question and answer with the in-room participants and also with those of you online. So not to worry, start to jot those down. But you know, first of all, we saw some of the data here. You all were able to see the data in full in the embargoed copy of the report that I sent you, and I know you've been mulling it over. I'm wondering what findings stood out for you in the report, whether they were surprising or affirming based on your own work. And Sandy, perhaps we can start with you and go down the line.
Okay, well, I don't think anybody, excuse me, anybody in this audience is overly surprised that we found dramatic differences by race and ethnicity in the participation and outcome patterns in higher education. But to me, one of the striking things that I think deserves more attention is more of the subtlety and the differences across subgroups. And so as mentioned, it's not always easy to look at, really break down the standard larger groups by race and ethnicity. But for example, when we looked at the difference in enrollment among subgroups of Asian students, you find that Chinese and Korean students have very high participation rates. But if you look at other subgroups of Asian students, you find very, very different patterns. And that's something that it's partly a data problem, but it really deserves more of our attention so that we don't make these generalizations. And in particular, one of the things that jumps out is the difference between Black and Hispanic students. And I think it's really easy for us to talk about underrepresented groups and basically mean Black and Hispanic students as one. But we saw some of the data up here about the differences between those two groups. One of the outstanding ones is student debt. We just saw a lot of details about that, and that Black students borrow much more than Hispanic students. But it's more than that. It's in their enrollment patterns that Black students disproportionately enroll in for-profit institutions, and Hispanic students, partly because they a lot of them live in Texas and California, tend to enroll in community colleges more often. The completion rates are much lower for Black students. And we really need to look at what is going on and why things are improving so much more for Hispanic students than they are for African American students. And so I think that that is one of the things that really comes out of the report, is the importance of looking in detail and trying to understand what's going on. And again, this is not, we don't have causation in here. The explanations are not here. But I think that these important data can really call our attention to very significant problems.
Thank you. Abram.
Well, I guess for me, I think the increasing segregation of Black students in for-profit institutions that are leading them to having a heavier, of course, debt load when they leave, which is potentially contributing to the growing wealth gap in this country. And so for me, that was striking. It's something that I already knew on some level, but to see the data, and to also see some of the other studies that have found that some of these for-profit institutions are specifically marketing their materials to aspiring Black students, and particularly low-income Black students. And so for me, this really affirmed some of the other data that I was seeing, which really surrounds this, from the marketing to the growing wealth gap.
Thank you. Cecilia.
For me, two very important things emerged from reading the report and being part a little bit of reading the report previously. One thing is the invisibility of Native American students in a lot of the data. It's 2019. And I remember when I was an intern in the White House for Hispanic Excellence, and I came to the NCES to ask why the data was reported that way, and they looked at me because it's always been like that. It's 2019, and we still can't put figures in those tables. And invisibility, as the new report of released by the Native American Indian College Fund, invisibility is the modern form of racism against Native American people. And that is very troubling to me. I understand the quantitative aspect of the lack of precision, but that cannot be any more an acceptable answer. If we are going to move forward, if they are, especially the tables, for instance, on debt, we have no idea about their needs. If we don't see their needs, we're never going to meet their needs. So invisibility matters. And it's something that we really need to take seriously, because there's many ways in which we can collaborate and build relationships with the tribes and with the nation. So maybe they help collect their own data. And the other is the importance of the two-year sector, the community college sector, which continues to be perceived as second-class institutions, and they serve the majority of underrepresented, Black, Native, Hispanic, of any group. And that is something that also needs to change, not only the mentality and the respect and the recognition, but the funding associated with that. They're serving the largest share of students that deserve and need the most, but they get severely less funding compared to other sectors, and that is particularly important to me.
Thank you. So these data, of course, don't present any causes, as Sandy said. These data don't themselves present solutions, but I do think that they are a reflection of what we see in broader society. And Ibram, you study race in America and in other settings, and there are larger societal and historical forces at play here. So how should we think about those issues when we look at these data, or vice versa?
So I think we have largely been taught, based on a series of ideas over the course of American history, that when we look at data like this, data that shows racial disparities between groups, that something must be wrong with those groups. Mm-hmm. In other words, something must be wrong with Hispanic students, something must be wrong with Native students, something must be wrong with Black students. And for us to realize, finally, that when we make that case about groups, we're articulating racist ideas. Mm-hmm. And so essentially, when we see disparities between groups, racial groups, there's only two causes. Either there's something wrong or right with particular groups, or there's some sort of policies or the lack of protective policies that is causing these disparities. And so I'm hoping that people will look at this data, not think that there's something wrong with particular racial groups, and instead try to figure out what's lacking or what policies we need to replace.
What are the types of policies that you've been looking at in your work, or practices that are going to close the gaps and further our understanding and remedy?
So I think that first and foremost, the ability, and I guess to continue what I talked about earlier, the ability for certain for-profit institutions to market their product in a particular way. There's very few amounts of regulation in terms of the way they're sort of marketing themselves to these students. But I think in a larger sense, when we look at even the data on the lack of faculty of color, particularly women of color, you have a situation in which you have departments that are able to pick and choose, and deans pick and choose continuously the same sort of areas of study in their particular disciplines, which you have a lack of people of color possibly studying in that area, and they know that that will then reproduce the current sort of setup of their department. But I think in a larger sense, you have universities refusing to go out and recruit the best Black and I should say non-white students in the way they're going out and recruiting the best athletes. And deans and department chairs are able to make excuses that coaches and athletic departments are not able to. And so I think that essentially, I don't want to sort of say the specific policies, because I think every institution is different. But what I'm ultimately saying is that we should not be blaming the people who are not at our institution for why they're not there. And the people at the institution should be looking in the mirror to try to understand why people are not there, or why people are leaving with higher debt burdens.
Could I add to
Yeah,
that?
please.
I think I agree with all of those things, but I think that this report is about higher education, so it doesn't focus on what happens to people before they get to the point of being able to participate in higher education. But it's really clear that There are all kinds of reasons that have to do with neighborhoods and access to health care and K-12 education and families and so on that have, that influence what the population looks like when they get to the point when they could be going to college and when they are selecting colleges and colleges are selecting them. And I'm not suggesting that we should say, oh, it's not higher education's problem, it's elsewhere. It is also elsewhere, but higher education needs to think also about what it can do to affect the earlier lives of these people, how it can contribute to communities, how it can produce students who are going to have the attitudes and the aspirations and the skills and the motivation to go out and help to make it so that people are better equipped to succeed in higher education when they get there. So I don't mean to say it's not a higher education problem. It is, but it's obviously not exclusively that.
No, it seems to be, as we said at the top, a broader societal, historical system that we're dealing with here that we see in these data. But speaking of some of the other sectors then, Sandy, we have a chapter in this report that focuses on workforce. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how we think about that chapter, those data, in light of some of what else we see in the study, including around how students finance their education.
Well, I think that the earnings and employment chapter is a really important part of the story because, of course, it's a circle, right? Like what we see there is that it's not just that white and Asian adults have higher levels of educational attainment, it's that within levels of educational attainment, there are dramatic differences in earnings patterns. And then those differences in earnings patterns, in turn, reinforce the circumstances of the next generation. So it's very clear that doing something about the labor market is a really important part of what has to happen. And I think that those earnings also explain part of why students, why Black students have more trouble repaying their debts, right? I mean, it's not just that they borrow more, it's that they have higher earnings with the same level of education. They don't have support from their families and so on to be able to repay those debts. So it's the debt data, I think, are terrifically important. I think this is a huge issue, but it's easier to sort of grab onto that and say, maybe if we just gave people more money, then they wouldn't borrow so much and all would be well. But I think if you put all the pieces together, you realize that it's a much bigger problem than just giving people a couple extra $1,000s to go to college. And the labor market issues are huge. And again, higher education has some responsibility for that.
Cecilia, yeah.
And I think piggybacking on what Sandy's saying is also you notice in the data very clearly that students are drawn into certain fields. And that is part of the story, that Hispanic students and Native American students are going to baccalaureate fields, not in healthcare, so therefore they're going to get the lowest reward in the labor market. So it's compounding these inequities and exacerbating and unmasking a lot of the reproduction that happens in higher education that I think the data is revealing. But there are definitely important things that we can do moving forward. College promise programs that are not just free college. I think we need to stop sending the message that it's a free college solution. It is an opportunity to enter into a higher education sector for some time, to not worry about how to pay for it, for the cost of attendance, but we know that the cost of college is higher than just paying for tuition. But those promise programs need to be supplemented. Like we have examples, like Long Beach has a very interesting college promise program that has a connection to the labor market, that has advising components, that has a whole package of services to students. And those are, I think, the types of solutions, in addition to more funding from the federal government and from the state government into this sector.
I'm glad you mentioned that, just about the holistic approach that we need to take with these solutions. And I think a number of the promising institutional examples are those that do that provide not just financial support, but academic and social support. What are you seeing, while we're on the topic, Cecilia, in your work on the two-year sector and the role that it plays, a little bit more to the point that you were making earlier?
Well, the community college, like I said, is playing a fundamental role in educating these students. The Aspen Institute just released a very interesting report on they have a strategic economic group, and they're estimating that the sector will need about $22 billion in investment in order to help contribute to closing the college completion gaps, or to increase them substantially in the years to come. There's estimates now of about how much money is going to require in terms of investment into this sector that, again, is serving the most deserving and needy students. So I think that's something that we need to consider. And I would say in terms of the data, culturally relevant data is needed, not just the pedagogies and the practices that happens inside classrooms that students need, but also culturally relevant metrics. For a lot of these students, completion means absolutely nothing, because they want to give back to their community. No one has asked them, do you serve in your community? We need in additional data that's reflected and grounded on the experiences and the lives of the students we desperately need to serve better.
Thank you. Sandy, I wonder if we might come back to you. You had started to talk a bit about how students pay for college. There's 2 chapters on there on undergraduate and graduate education. What do the data tell us, and what do they not tell us?
The main thing, I think, that emerges from the data, it's going to help a little bit,
Yeah, and we can come back to you if you need
is about student debt, and it's just dramatic. And I think other people have called attention to this, but Black students borrow more. They borrow more if they have the same incomes. They borrow more if they go to the same institutions. We understand some of the reasons. We know about low-income families. We know that families with the same income levels have lower assets. But we know that Black students wait longer to go to college, and if you're older when you go to college, you're likely to borrow more. You have more responsibilities at the time. We know that they take longer to get their degrees. So there are lots of variables that contribute, but we need to understand this better, and we need to figure out how to solve it. Because we talk a lot about student debt as a general problem, and that's just not really the way that we're going to solve the problems of the groups that are really struggling. So I think that's the main financing issue that emerges. I think there's been discussion of the for-profit sector, and this is a huge issue. There are for-profit institutions that serve students well, and there are nonprofit institutions that don't, but the data are so clear about the general trends, and we have to give people better guidance and information when they make their choices. And we don't just need another website with information. We need real personalized guidance to help students make better decisions about when, where, and what to study.
Thank you. I know we run the risk with these data of painting a broad brush, right? I mean, we talk a lot in the aggregate. We do take aim in this report and on our website to really try to get to some of the nuance, but data is often sold in aggregate. It's talked about that way. Are there things in the report or in what you heard today that need more nuance, really require it, that we just can't paint the broad brush? I think the debt situation is one of those. We can't just paint a broad brush. Debt is a problem for everyone. We actually dig deeper and we see that it is much more of an issue for some populations. Does anything stand out in that way to you? And yeah, any of you? This was unscripted, by the way. It just came to me that we do that. I mean, I think institutional type is another one. I mean, you mentioned that there are some institutions that serve students well that are for-profit and nonprofits that don't. Yes.
So I haven't read the full report.
It's 338 pages, so I don't fault you for that.
So if this isn't the full report, please forgive me. But
yes.
I think that if it was possible to determine how students were faring in different areas. So in other words, were they more likely to drop out were, for instance, women of color more likely to drop out in the STEM fields than they were these other fields. And then also persistence rates, correlated by field. Like that would have been interesting to me because I know that particularly in the STEM fields, it's an area that women of color have struggled to persist. I shouldn't say persist. Their retention rates aren't as high as white men, and I know at least as relates to faculty, they're the least likely to be tenured. And so I'm wondering if that is occurring across the board, particularly with students, and if that's starting early.
Yeah, and I guess we do as a society, as educators, we pay a lot of attention to STEM because it's where some of the greatest gains are in terms of employment, salaries, knowledge production, a host of things. I could see us do more in some of the other fields. But just going back to a higher level here, Ibram, while I have you, you had started out talking a bit about who we point the finger at, right? And that we really need to stop pointing the finger at the students and start looking in the mirror or pointing it to other parts of society. But how, as a field, how do we talk and act upon these and other data on race in a way that acknowledges and really rejects that deficit-minded framework? How do we do that?
I think first to accept that is what we're doing. In other words, for us to have a recognition of what the deficit model is, essentially to say that this data is because there's something wrong with these students, whether there's something wrong with where they came from, whether it's something wrong with the way they were trained before they got to higher education, or whether there's something wrong with the way they operate in higher education. All of that encompasses a deficit model. And so I think we first have to accept that. And it is certainly the case that that higher education is not the only sort of place and space in this society that there are all these sorts of disparities. But the question is always, again, why? Like, what is really behind this? And I know for me, I constantly am told, whether as a Black student and ultimately as a Black faculty, that it's something wrong with Black students and faculty, either partly or totally, either behaviorally, culturally, or even sometimes genetically. And so, why can't we as a nation finally reject that as an explanation when we have consistently shown that it's either culturally biased, it's never been proven, or has been outright disproven, and accept the reality that racial groups are equal, and instead start looking for policies or even institutions or even the lack of protective policies that are actually causing these disparities.
I think that inviting also other scholars to comment on the data that are doing critical work, like Jameson Lopez, that is proposing these culturally relevant metrics to include others and to contest the interpretation of this data. I think the multiplicity of voices, especially voices of those at the margins, I think will be essential to enrich this conversation of what it means for people, for community college students. What does it mean for them when they see these tables? We tend to just focus the conversation on the academics or the people who know and who has interpreted the data, who has a degree, but for people outside of this room and out there fighting and struggling with class and work and kids and jobs, and this data probably means very different things to them. So I would like to maybe see some inclusion of all those other voices.
Can I just say that I think also in terms of including other voices and broadening the audience, my strong suspicion is that a very high percentage of the people in this room and in the audience online and everywhere listening to this today are people who see things pretty much the same way, and that the people who really need to understand some of these messages are not listening. I will say I was 2 days ago in a very different conversation that was about competition and how the for-profit sector is going to solve all of our problems. And I was I was in the minority in that conversation. But the question that I heard that was the most amazing to me was somebody in the audience said, how is it possible that colleges are actually accepting and enrolling students who are not academically ready for college work? Why would they ever do that? And I listened to the people responding, the experts responding, and they said, well, obviously because there's money in it. That's the only reason that colleges would ever take students who aren't already prepared. And it was the most, it was just shocking to me to listen to how long it took before somebody finally said, well, also, we actually believe in second chances. And so when you realize this is a conversation about higher education among people who are, many of them, writing books about it and are thinking about it all the time, we have to talk to these people if we want to change the way the system works and the opportunities that are available to people.
I think I would second that, because probably those are the people that I said earlier that think that community colleges are second-class institutions offering different types of opportunities for people. So I completely agree that those are the audiences that we definitely need to reach in order to have more conversation and more dialogue about what this means and what to do about it.
And I can agree with that too. and I think one of the ways we can reach them is people who are resisting change are typically thinking about their current situation and comparing it to what they could lose. And we're constantly, in a sense, reinforcing that narrative, as opposed to talking to them about what these changes could allow them to gain. And so if they're in the current setup, their child is able to go to the most highly selective institution in the state, but because of the current set of policies, their kid is not able to compete with others going to the most highly selective institution in the country. In a different type of scenario, they would be. And so I think that that's another way in which we could have those conversations.
Okay, well, we've started a great conversation here. I want to invite the audience, both online and in the room, and I know we have mics on either side of the room, so please use those so that the online audience can hear you. And if nobody's getting up from the in-room, oh, great, thank you.
This is fascinating.
And please introduce yourself,
I'm
that'd be
Mike
great.
Potterella, Vice President, General Counsel, University of Maryland, College Park, so I Ubered here today. It's nice to be in the DMV. Thank you all for being here. You know, it strikes me, and I've been in higher ed about 20 years. I've worked at 3 state flagship universities, so on the public side, that a lot of this data is gathered at a time where we've seen the cost of public higher education be shifted significantly to students and families. Right. And Sandy, it was your comment that caused me that light bulb to go off a little bit. When we think about the people that need to hear this, and I know I'm not getting into your level of policy analysis, but I'm taking it up a little bit and wondering, what do we need to do if we're going to support community colleges, if we want to support people who have financial need? Don't we need to get especially our state leaders, to understand the importance of making a bigger public investment for everybody?
Of course, I think that would be the first step is to, I think, for instance, California is trying to move in that direction with the new student center funding formula. And that's, I think, the same message that the Aspen Institute, the new report that they released, is doing the same type of push for bipartisan solutions that address the human capital. The way they're framing, of course, is human capital needs for the new global economy, right? What we're talking about is providing opportunities for those who need it and deserve it the most. So it's the language is very different. They claim it is a human capital argument. We can debate where it's not, but I think what we need is a serious investment, public investment in community colleges. That's what I would advocate for.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that question.
I'm Meryl Schwartz with the Association of Governing Boards, and this question is for Cecilia Aguilar. Governing boards are responsible for a whole host of policies that can impact equity and equitable outcomes in higher education. But one of the things that this meeting's about today and that I think is very important is having good data and looking at data in a disaggregated way so you understand the differential admissions, distribution of students among fields, retention, and so on. Cecilia, you mentioned culturally sensitive metrics, and I wondered what you mean and what that might mean for people working in higher education. What should we be measuring to understand the impact of our institutions?
Thank you for the question. As I would love to share you that paper that was published in I think this year, and it's Jameson Lopez at the University of Arizona. He's a Native American scholar who did a quantitative analysis of all these federal data sets and said this is what they're claiming that they cannot get to the sampling approach, but he's proposing a whole nother set of questions added to those surveys that could get into these culturally relevant metrics that matter for Native American students. And I guess we could develop similar for Latino, Hispanic students, for Black and African American students. But the point is that we need, for a lot of people, just finishing college really doesn't mean much. It means that I can go back to my community to help others. It means more that I'm going to support my family. It means, so I think we have to think about those metrics in terms of the job market. We always tend to measure, did they get a job, a well-paying job? Yeah, but where? Is it close to your family? I mean, there's a lot of things we could be asking that are more sensitive and relevant for the populations we're discussing today.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Please.
Hi, my name is David Days. I'm with the Learning Policy Institute. So I definitely don't want to let a lot of these higher ed institutions off the hook in terms of like the culture they foster on campuses and some of their selectivity choices and that sort of thing. But something I was wondering if you could comment on was particularly credit rates and the role that that plays in sort of fostering this discrepancy, but then also when in terms of repayment, the discrepancy between like interest rates and the amounts that students have to pay over time. Thank you.
So just so I'm clear, interest rates and the first.
Sorry, credit ratings.
Credit
and the role that
ratings.
that plays in borrowers and interest rates that they have to pay in the long term.
So these other forces that influence the loan debt and.
Are you talking about student loans and the circumstances, the conditions of the student loans? Yeah. So for federal student loans, I mean, for federal student loans, everybody gets the same loan, right? So it doesn't matter. Now, there are proposals to sort of give students like higher interest rates if they're higher risk or whatever, or to discourage them from enrolling in the wrong institutions. But our federal student loan program actually is, pretty neutral in terms of that. You can argue about whether the interest rates are too high or too low, or the repayment rates are too high or too low. And certainly we need to change the repayment system so that there's less bureaucracy and that there are fewer hurdles, bureaucratic hurdles in particular, that people have to cross. And the parent loan situation is a much more complicated situation, and the graduate student loans are more complicated. But I think that right now the issue is that we do have a federal student loan system that is equal across students, but there are lots of voices suggesting that maybe we should replace it with a more market-oriented system that would be more based on your credit scores and so on. And that's viewed as like it would be a symbol and maybe improve student outcomes. I think we should watch carefully movements in that direction.
So this is a question to the whole panel. I found it very interesting what you're all talking about. I'm one of those Black students who has a lot of debts. I'll just be very honest here. I got $60,000 debt. I've been out of school for about 4 years, haven't paid a dime of it because I can't afford it. And what I found interesting when I looked at this data is, I'm Chris with the Urban Alliance, so I bring that out. But I found interesting when you looked at this data here from 1995 to 96 to 2015 to 2016, what I found most fascinating was that the white enrollment rate declined significantly from 69%, approximately 70%, to about 52%. But during that time, we've also seen the racial wealth gap grow specifically. So my question is, if whites are enrolling in college at a significantly lower rate over this period of time, are we still making the right decision by encouraging underrepresented groups to go further into college when the racial wealth gap is widening?
So on the data, first of all, I think slight difference in the way you're describing it. So that's really the share. That's a graph that talks about share, and so it adds to 100. So as you have more students of color come in, the share of whites necessarily declines. Okay. It doesn't mean that they're going at a higher rate. They're going at lower rates. Oh, okay. Just to be clear about that, I know that's a common way to read that, but there's a deeper question here than that data.
And I think what you're also referring to is within the Black community, and I suspect other communities, but I know best within the Black community, it is taught pretty religiously that the route or journey to success and financial freedom is through college. Mm-hmm. And if you do not take that route, then you're going to be financially strapped. Mm-hmm. And so I think one of the things that the data is showing is that it's not that clear cut, right? Particularly the institutions you choose. And so I think that is something, I think, within the Black community, and I suspect within other communities, that we have to sort of rethink. Because what happens is when you have a Black person who has a high school diploma and is enrolled, I should say, who has a blue-collar job making $50,000 or $60,000 a year, you have other people telling him or her that they are not successful and that they should potentially move into higher education to basically become more financially successful. And some of those people do that and become more financially successful, and others do not. And so I think it's something we should, of course, rethink.
Let me just say that I think that there's a real risk of making misleading generalizations because of the variation in the data. There is no question but that the probability that individual students will succeed socially and economically is much greater if they have higher levels of education. That's really true. That does not mean that everyone who goes to college makes more money than everyone who doesn't. And this, for example, of somebody making $60,000 a year without any college education, that's great. There are too many examples of people who go to college and then they end up worse off than they were before because they go to the wrong place, because they study the wrong thing, because they borrow too much money. So we need to stop that. But that doesn't mean that my fear is that the solution to them will be, boy, that was a mistake to go to college. Let's not aspire to that. And the problem is that we're not guiding students and giving them the opportunities to go to the right places and do the right things with the right support systems. So I think it's a much more complicated question that doesn't have good one-liners, but we shouldn't assume that the solution is for people not to pursue post-secondary education.
And I hope that you didn't get that.
No, I just feel like I want to make sure that that doesn't, that's not the message.
Yeah, it's just very it's more complicated.
Yeah.
Okay, yes.
Hi, my name is Rhonda Myers, and I'm with Northern Virginia Community College. One of the questions you asked the panel was about what things were excluded or could have been included.
Yeah.
What was glaring, at least to me, is that in a report on race and ethnicity in higher education, there was no sub-reporting of the impacts of HBCUs, HSIs, tribal colleges, really to speak to, just to provide a broader context to higher education. And so that may have been a missed opportunity or an intentional, I'm sure there was some intentionality behind it, but when I was going through it, that just seemed to be lost.
We do, in fact, have an entire chapter on minority-serving institutions in the report where we take a look at their contributions to degree attainment. We actually do a lot of work on MSIs And at ACE, we've done a lot of work on the power of MSIs in promoting social mobility. We've looked at the way that the federal government classifies completion and how that is not a clear picture or not an accurate picture when it comes to what MSIs actually contribute. So I hear you on the MSIs. Take a look at that chapter. Let me know if that's not meeting the need that you think a report like this should, because I take all constructive criticism here. I want to make sure that we have the right data for you to use in your work. And we have another shot with a second report. So please do follow up and let me know more about that. Thanks. I don't know if you want to add anything.
No, I was going to suggest that there is an invited essay too, I think, on MSIs.
We do, yes, that's right.
So I think maybe
on one, not here.
On the full report.
Yeah, the full report. Mm-hmm. Yes, in the full report. Yes, the 338-page report. Yeah, it's a lot. That's the point, right? That's great. Thank you so much for that question. Yes, shall we bounce over here?
Yes, one question. Good morning, everyone. I'm Archie Urban. I'm here representing the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Ed. And I have a question for you, Laurel. I've anticipated this day. And one of those who have missed this report over the last years and ask a question. Your plans for the continuity of these reports. Is this going to be an annual or a biennial or that kind of question? I want to hear your thoughts about that. And also to follow up there are some real important opportunities to add some disaggregations that could help us make sense even in a descriptive way. Yeah. And if you have thoughts about doing that in the near future, if you would share what those are.
Yeah, absolutely. So we want this project to continue. After this is a first phase grant from the Mellon Foundation for 3 years. We have another report, as I mentioned, coming out. It won't quite be every year. That's a lot of work for the research team. It might mean we can do nothing else. We do want to do other things. So it'll probably be every other year or a little bit less than that. We need support to do this work. So this is my plea to the philanthropic community, and Travis is sitting right in front of me. You know, we like other nonprofits need resources to do this. So, you know, it is my hope that this report gets the amount of attention that it deserves and that the money just shows up. So that is, I'm gonna put that out there in the universe. That's what I want. So we are committed to continuing, and we wanna do more than just a report. And that's really important. We wanna have ongoing conversation. We want many voices at the table. We've got lots of opportunities. We've got the higheredtoday.org blog that I wanna plug for contributors. Essays, you know, we've got a lot of ground to cover. We've got the website. So I really am trying to have us approach this as a multi-channel effort, and NADOHE is a perfect partner, and we will in fact be at your annual conference talking about these data. So that also means that we need to spread the word as well.
Just a final note, if you don't already have, and I'm sure you probably do, but a small stakeholders group advising the evolution of this report in the future would be beneficial, maybe. So,
yes, we have, and maybe you just volunteered to join. We have an esteemed group of researchers that study diversity, equity, and inclusion that include other economists as well, multiple disciplines at the table to help us really do the right type of interpretation of these data, in addition to approach the analyses in the right way. And we also have a communications committee that helps us think about how we get the word out. So I'll absolutely follow up with you, Archie, about that. And I agree on data disaggregation. I will say that there's a very important call for better data to disaggregate. The unfortunate reality is someone mentioned sample sizes, and we're not necessarily asking the right questions, et cetera. So we can do only so much at the federal level. It is my hope in the next report and in future reports that we might work with states and their data systems and really try to get to the granularity you're speaking of that we can't do in some of what we've already examined. Thank you so much, Archie, for that. Yeah.
Hi, good morning. I'm Leticia Bustillos from the Campaign for College Opportunity out of California. It's always startling to see the lack of diversity that exists among faculty, among our presidents. And despite the increase in diversity and inclusion efforts, it seems that those numbers remain stubbornly small. So I'm wondering, what more do we need to do to increase representation and among faculty and among senior leadership at our campuses?
Thank you. I'll let the panel start. I have thoughts too, but I'm the moderator.
So from what I understand, one of the things that I think some institutions are seeking to do, some deans are seeking to do, some provosts are seeking to do, is to diversify the pools of candidates. And so sending back the candidate pool if it's not diverse enough. But I think a more successful tactic is to expand the policies that allow for departments to do what's called target opportunity hires, in which the department can collectively say, okay, we want to go and get this faculty member, because trying to essentially diversify candidate pools is much, much harder than the department coming together and deciding they want this highly qualified candidate. And then expanding that across the institution. Of course, cluster hires are also something that has worked, in which for campuses that have a lower percentage of faculty of color, and trying to ask one or two people to come and be the only person in a department may not lead to their retention. And so cluster hires have also worked. And then I think focusing on those areas in which there are larger numbers of faculty of color. And so expanding the African American, Latino studies, Native studies, Asian American studies programs, which are disproportionately have people of color working in those fields. That's also a way that colleges and universities have successfully diversified.
I think I'm just going to say something then. I think we also need to think about the pathway to the faculty. I mean, the pathway goes right through higher education, and unfortunately still goes through too small a number of institutions, right? So faculty often perpetuate their own trajectory in who they hire. And if we keep doing that, we're not going to get to diversity given where the students of color are. So that's one thing. We have a great essay in the report written by Kimberly Griffin at the University of Maryland, College Park, just exactly on faculty diversity. So you'll find it in there, and you'll find it on the microsite. I guess I'll also say, as somebody who graduated 10 years ago who didn't go faculty route after a PhD, one thing that we struggled with was the attractiveness of that route, right? So when you see your faculty of color role models sort of struggling because they are one of so few, and being tokenized in a way that, be on every committee, you represent diversity, it looks taxing, right? And I think many of them would say it is, but the rewards exceed that. But there's something there about, does it look attractive? And this is just a reinforcing cycle, unfortunately. I don't know if you want to add anything.
And the retention piece, I think we're so worried about getting them in, but then if we don't change other things and worry about the retention, then we may be creating more problems because they may not feel supported, they may not feel. So the cluster hire, I think it's a pretty good idea, but I think thinking of retention and how we're gonna do the mentoring, the hand-holding, crediting invisible work, and there's that battle right now on the equity, diversity, inclusion statements now required for promotion and tenure for UCLA's in that front. So there are different ways, but we need to change habits and mindsets.
Great. Thank you very much.
Habits and mindsets. That's a great way to summarize many of these points. Please.
Hi, I'm Oliver Shack. I'm a senior research analyst at the Education Trust. I would first say I really appreciate the conversation about segregation into for-profit institutions. I would just point out that I really think that that's a symptom of underrepresentation in traditional higher education, especially at public four-year institutions. We'll have some work coming out on that actually pretty soon. My question is actually about, there's been all these allusions to data limitations, and well, maybe we can patch together data from states or NSC, but my question would be more broadly, how should we improve access to good quality data, and is it time for student level data being collected by the federal government?
Sandy, you're in
Yes.
data a lot.
Yes,
What do
it
you
is
think?
time. I mean, really, that we need that if we want to have good data to really look at this. That's what we need, and I don't know, maybe eventually we'll get it, but I agree.
And I mean, I think to me, as a researcher of racism, I understand that data is the lifeblood of being able to see the existence of racial disparities and thereby the existence of racist policies. And so those who essentially do not want us to recognize that and see that and want us to believe we're in a post-racial society are going to resist efforts to collect data, particularly categorized by race. And so I just wanted to make sure we understand that, and they understand that. They understand that is the lifeblood. And so I think, so I'm so happy you asked this question because it's so critical that we do those very simple and hard things to basically gather the data.
Thank you. Yes.
My name is Chloe Lee. I'm actually a student at American University. I think one of the factors that I think is ignored a lot about why students of color don't stay in college or don't go to colleges, especially four-year private colleges, is that when you are facing racism on a daily basis, you don't want to be there anymore. I was wondering how can we combat that outside of just bridge programs that exist at AU or UMD, or having more diverse faculty?
Thank you. Yes, racial climate.
So I mean, I think we should have zero tolerance for it. I think in talking to faculty and administrators and staff, after these types of incidents in which they talk about how, that perpetrator just did not know, because typically that's what the perpetrator said. I didn't realize wearing blackface was something that was offensive. And so that then digs into them as educators to want to educate them, and thereby not presumably have zero tolerance for their type of behavior. But then simultaneously, those who are affected by that and see that student and other students like them being sort of coddled, and that's the way it's sort of perceived, it makes them believe that this is going to persist. And so for me, if in the 90s, we talked in K, I should say, it was talked about how students of color, when they were going to their K through 12 schools, there was zero tolerance for bad behavior. Anybody know what I'm talking about? So why can't we
Zero
have
tolerance policies.
Literally zero tolerance for racist behavior?
And I would encourage you to tune into the live stream at our annual meeting that I mentioned at the top, because I think we'll dig right into a question just like that, including higher education's role in promoting tolerance and understanding. Yeah. Thank you. Back over here.
Good morning. My name is Sharon Freeze-Britt. I'm professor of higher education, University of Maryland, College Park. Thank you for this work, but I have to start with, my heart's heavy.
Yeah.
I want to speak the truth. I'm really very disheartened by the compound erosion, particularly for the African-American community and other communities. So I need to just, sometimes in our higher education settings, I've been in higher ed for 38 years, we do a great job of, when we do see the data, of looking at it and talking about it in a very intellectual sense. And my entire center of my heart is troubled. And what I'm interested in us doing is really pointing to the ways in which our campuses have merely forced Black students to look for other alternatives, because we've not dealt with the day-to-day interactions. It is some of what folks have said, the climate. As a professor who's had to climb the rank, I understand what my students have gone through, and I'm really troubled. I'm troubled by our, we should be incensed by this. We've lost ground. We've lost ground. We're 2019, and we're talking as if this is 1950-something. And so I certainly hope, and one of the reasons why there's a gap in the erosion, and I'm glad Mellon Foundation Bill and Melinda Gates and anybody else ought to pour money because we as a nation are now at a deficit. It's going to take us longer to fill these gaps and to now raise and ask questions that we were actually having some data on. We actually were beginning to understand that, but we have a very narrow understanding of what serves as data and information in higher education. And as we open this circle up, it needs to be more than culturally relevant. It needs to include people who come at and understand the picture of these issues from lots of different perspectives. And so I feel a sense of sorrow for all of us because we have significant work to do. So I don't have a particular question, except for to say how bold and innovative are we going to be? Because this is no longer acceptable.
I just want to thank you because it is important to bring those emotions, and it does. The body reacts to reading this, and sometimes that's what people don't understand, that when you see these numbers and think of the communities and the people who daily are struggling, it takes a different connotation than just an intellectual action. So thank you for reminding us of that.
Yeah, thank you. And I've been feeling the same way, which is why I think you've seen quite a bit of passion coming from me.
Yeah, I'm with you too, Sharon.
Yes, thank you.
As somebody who's been living with these data for the last year and a half, thank you for sharing that. And Sharon is a collaborator of ours, and you can see why. And we've talked about this too, haven't we? Yeah, please.
Well, so I started off thinking about a question, and then I heard you. So I'm a little blown away. My name is Sharon, also Sharon Bland. I'm the Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer at Montgomery College down the street. So I wanted to ask a couple of things. One, around the notion of more students of color attending for-profit institutions. And one of the reasons offered for that was marketing. I'd be curious to know if there have been any longitudinal studies on the trajectory of those students and any surveys of those students as to why they believe that they were interested in attending for-profit institutions. And then secondly, along the lines of the administration and non-white administrators, I'm also curious to know if there have been any studies around. So traditionally, in the Black community, public school teaching has been a route of success, and I'm just wondering why has been limited seemingly to K through 12 as opposed to higher education.
I do know of a study. I don't know if it's not a quantitative study. It's not about surveys, but it just struck me. It's by one of my colleagues at Johns Hopkins, Stephanie DeLuca. She's a sociologist, and she studied youth in Baltimore for a long period of time. So it's longitudinal, qualitatively speaking. And I remember when I read the study, it struck me because she talks about African American youth wanting to become someone fast. So as much as the marketing is, we talked about that, but it's this idea that I want to be someone sooner rather than later. I can't afford taking, we talk about 2-year colleges. I think that's another term we have to really rethink. They're not 2-year. Most people spend there at least 5 years. So it's taking too long to get a job and to become someone. So I think it's offered as a solution to that, right? And the problem that she identifies is that the institution offers that idea, packages it really well marketing-wise, but then they fall through in the promise. So it's a fascinating study that I would invite you to. It's published in the Sociology of Education. And it's a fascinating study, I think, about some of the understanding from the youth perspective of why they would attend those institutions.
And I think that sounds like a really interesting study. And the for-profit question is actually more complicated than we're making it sound, because the reality is that if you look, for example, at completion rates of short-term programs, they're higher at the for-profits than they are in community colleges. And so for-profits specialize in short-term certificates. Community colleges do more of associate degrees. And so this idea that people want to do something that's quick is really important. There are also flexible schedules. There's much more sort of, you go there, we're going to tell you what to do. You take this path, you take these courses, and you'll get through and you'll get your certificate. And then maybe you won't, and maybe it won't be, marketable. But there are things that on average for-profit colleges do very well. And those have to do with these short-term programs and these very straightforward paths. And so, and then some of them can be very good. They're convenient. They're all over the place. They're mostly online, and we've got to be really worried. This online thing is that, if you can just do it online and then, your kids are at home and you don't have to go anywhere. But we do know that actually low income and underrepresented students do worse in fully online courses, and it actually increases the socioeconomic gaps because everybody needs personal, learning is a social process. And so we have to watch those things, but we need to make for-profit institutions better. We need to get rid of the really bad ones, and we need to help students make decisions, but I think we can, it's a problem. Part of the problem is with community colleges. They're under-resourced institutions where many students flounder. So it's not as simple as it sounds. It's a huge problem because they end up with lots of debt. They spend lots of money, and that is just something that is and the evidence is that you don't earn as much if you've gone to a for-profit as if you haven't.
Thanks. I think we'll have to maybe talk about the second part of your question after, because I want to make sure that we get through. So we have 1 minute. I think I'm going to go. I know this. The problem is I can't see over there. I know you've been standing there for a while. Let's perhaps just do a speed round. How about that? Because I don't want to leave.
Okay, this is my fastest.
Okay,
my name is Robert Graham. I'm from George Mason University. On the feedback tip, I appreciate the work, thinking about future analysis. I appreciate the experiences that Black men and women have in common in higher ed students, but I went straight to the summary here looking for some data on Black male experiences. Given that racism has affected us differently in higher ed, we can now see disparate outcomes. I think it'd be really important to have some data that sort of spotlights each group in future work.
Yes.
That's all I got.
Once again, in the report, we have, I know I keep saying that, but I couldn't print all of those for everyone. But we do have some gender breakdowns by race. There's actually quite a bit in the report. Again, if what you're looking for isn't there, please let me know. We will be fortunate also to have a scholar on Black males in education on the stage next who might unpack some of that. But thank you so much for that. I really appreciate the comment. We'll think about doing more of that in the next report. Okay, let's go here, and then we've got one more, so we'll go with you and then.
Hi, good morning. I have a few questions. So
okay, ask us one. Because we're over time now.
Yeah. I am really interested in how this could maybe be used for the free college platform that Congress might be considering coming up. So I'm wondering if you guys had any ideas for how the data could be maybe leveraged into policy actions. And then just if I got to ask maybe another measure that we could look at and potentially in the future is how well are career guidance centers doing at helping students get jobs directly out of college to help with that pipeline gap. I'm not sure if that's exactly the question, but some sort of question where the college helped me get the job.
Sure, thank you. Thank you for that. Policy implications, quickly.
I think that the policy, there are very clear issues that are highlighted here that have to do with opportunity before college, during college, and after college that Congress obviously could do a lot about, and we'll all have different suggestions. I don't think that the solution necessarily is the free college route that you mentioned, but it is clear that Congress has to get its act together and make some really important steps in terms of supporting students and particularly focusing on the students who are struggling most.
Hi, my name is Nora Goldstein, and I'm here representing the Association of Community College Trustees. My role at ACCT is I run the Governance Institute for Student Success, and in that role, I have an incredible opportunity around this country to set up training institutes for college trustees, board members, and their presidents. And one of our big projects has been working with the tribal colleges and universities. Now today I've heard a lot of words about changing our mindset, having a new set of metrics. And one of the things, if I've learned anything with our work with the tribal colleges, we've worked with them for the last 3 years, we intend to work with them more, and the American Indian Higher Ed Consortium. When you look at American Indian populations and higher ed, you have to look at it twofold. Number one, you have to look at how well the students are doing in mainstream colleges around this country. And the second thing is you have to look at the tribal colleges, just as you have to look more closely, and someone mentioned this, at the HBCUs, the MSIs, and the tribal colleges and universities. Now, I'll speak specifically about them because I'm publishing an article about them in my trustee talk, but I'm also publishing a magazine called Celebrating TCU Successes. And Abram, what you said, we don't need to play the blame game. But more importantly, and my husband would love this when I get the last word here, the last speaker, is that we as a society have to look at our values. I love data. The GISS is about data-informed governance. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation funded us years ago. So we go in there thinking that we're going to help these trustees and presidents look at data so that they can make good policy decisions and good things about student success. But the TCUs have taught me something. I don't go in there saying, here's the blueprint of how we're going to do this. What I do is I work with AHEC and I work with the tribal colleges. They have a completely different measuring system. It's called AIMS. And when I ask them, what are the student momentum points we should be looking at? Yes, they have retention. Yes, they have completion. But the single most important indicator for them has to do with their goals. Their goals are to perpetuate their culture, their language, and their spirituality. It is a completely different mindset. And Cecilia, you said we need a new set of metrics, and I completely agree with you. And in my report to the Lumina Foundation, who has funded our work with the TCUs, I'm going to be mentioning what they tell me, what I have learned about what is culturally relevant and important to them. And I hope this work with the TCUs can be a model for our work with the MSIs and the HBCUs, et cetera.
Thank you. I think we need to end because I want to give us a break. Thank you so much for raising TCUs. We have a little bit of data in the report, not enough. This is another population that goes very under-measured and not the right measures, to your point, Cecilia, about culturally minded measures. So thank you for that comment. I want to thank our panelists. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be right back with another panel that you will not want to miss.
All right, everybody, if you could find your seats, we'll get started again. Terrific. If you're filling your coffee cup outside, bring it on in. And we'll get right back to it. Those of you online, find a seat. Here we go. Well, thanks everybody for the great Q&A. We're going to do the same, pretty much the same format for this second panel. So I've got a couple of questions to start us off, and then once the panelists get tired of my questions, which will be soon, then we'll turn to you, which will be ever more interesting. And I want to encourage those of you who are joining us online
to submit your questions, and we'll be happy to add them to the queue. So to start, let me make sure that you know who we are. Those of you who missed the early morning session, Ted Mitchell, President of the American Council on Education. I'm joined by my colleagues and friends, Millie Garcia, the President of the Association of State Colleges and Universities, Sean Harper, who has more professorial titles than anyone I've ever known. I won't read them all, but Sean is the executive director, among all of his academic honors. He's the executive director of the USC Race and Equity Center and one of the co-sponsors for today's event, and a collaborator on this work. And Julie Park, who is an associate professor at the University of Maryland. So let's dive right in. So Sharon, you gave us a challenge at the end of the last session, and our job up here is to start to move to some of the solution sets that come out of the great discussion that we've had and out of the data. And as we've all said, and the previous panel said, these are not simple issues. They are issues that relate to how we see the world, how we see each other, how we see ourselves. Those are very, very deep issues. They're also about policy, whether that's federal policy or institutional policy, and it's about practice. It's about the way we think about institutions working on a day-to-day basis to try to change some of these numbers. And so, Sharon, the challenge you gave us was, I think, in short, how bold do we dare be with all this work, and where would we start? And so that's where I'd like to start with the panel, is put on sort of the big, bold, no holds barred. This is a world that we can change. A couple of crazy, audacious ideas just to start the conversation. Millie, what do you think?
You know, Sharon, thank you so much. When you think about this, it's time, right? We've been talking about this for a long time. Leadership matters. And let's be very clear about that. The president sets the tone. It is, yes, everybody, the faculty, the staff, the community are engaged. But the president sets the tone in the strategic plan and the vision on what you do at an institution, how you hold people accountable, how you execute and implement. My Mexican-American friends taught me a wonderful thing. This research is not new. Tiene que tener las ganas. You have to have the will. And as a president, we say in our mission statements, we will be, anyone that enters our doors will come into a welcoming, inclusive environment where they will learn and reach their highest potential. We accepted that mantra, and so we have to make sure we do that. So let me begin with one example, because I could talk about this for days. After 3 presidencies, I think I've had a lot of scars on my back. So let me just give one example. How do you hold your vice presidents and deans accountable to the statistics that you said you were going to reach? How do you have your academic deans look at their student body? Where do they come from? What high schools? What languages do they speak at home? What's their income? What do they do with their families? Have the faculty and staff in each college understand their students and help them where they're from and help them reach those high standards. And then as a president, I would sit down with every academic dean once a year and say to them, here are all the students in your college. Here are them broken down by ethnicity, by race, by age. How are we doing in retention and graduation rates? How are we doing in those gateway courses? And if you have a problem, what are you doing about it? You hold people accountable the way you hold them accountable when you're talking about their budget and how they run the college and how they put together a schedule. And so I'll just start with that so that I can let my other colleagues have some time to talk.
Thank you. And just to tie it back, I mean, that's a whole different way of thinking about metrics, right? And I would add to it, how do boards hold the president accountable for that? Sean?
Let me start by saying happy Valentine's Day. And start with a serious word of thanks and congratulations to Laurel Espinosa and her team for producing this really important report. Ted, it's totally reckless of you to invite me to be bold. Okay, let me try this out and see if this is bold enough. I so appreciated that my good friend and colleague Sharon Friesbritt, named that we're not in the 1950s, right? But the kinds of inequities that we're talking about have been talked about, for decades now. I also appreciated that one of the other colleagues here asked the question, how frequently will this report be updated and released? When that question was asked, I thought to myself almost immediately, if it's 2 years from now, or if it's every 4 years, or even, a decade from now until the next one, the data are going to be likely the same. Right. Until and unless we do something to remediate the racial illiteracy of people who lead institutions and people who work on the faculties at colleges and universities. Sure, many of the inequities that are pointed out in the report can be attributed to the under-preparation for the rigors of college that occurs in high school. Sure, poverty plays a role. Absolutely, climate plays a role, and I so appreciate that there was so much emphasis on the last panel about climate. But I am going to argue that part of the persistence and the pervasiveness of racial inequity in higher education is attributable to the fact that the people who are supposed to do something about closing the inequities and closing the gaps between groups actually don't know how to do that because they never learned how to do so anywhere in their educational or professional upbringing. And there isn't a real understanding of the comprehensive nature of strategy and intentionality that these kinds of problems and opportunities require. So at the USC Race and Equity Center, we have a professional learning series and organizational change effort that we call the USC Equity Institutes, in which we teach college presidents and their cabinets and deans and department chairs how to do racial equity, not just how to value it, not just how to articulate a commitment to it, but how to actually roll up their sleeves and address these very vexing issues. At this point, time's up on just talking about the problems, right? We have to equip educators and leaders with the skills that these problems require.
So equity-based leadership is not just a slogan, it's a skills-based thing that we need to get serious about.
Yeah, absolutely. And it does require, so I threw out the word racial illiteracy earlier. It does require racial literacy. One of the things that we often say in the institutes is that you can't do racial equity if you can't talk about race.
That's right.
And there are too few people on campuses who actually have the skills or the courage to talk openly and honestly about race and raise race questions. So they run themselves in circles trying to do racial equity work without being able to actually name the problem that they're trying to solve.
And we're going to come back and talk about that when we focus a little bit more on climate and how to build those sets of conversations down into the organization. Julie?
Yeah. My big, bold dream is that every university leader, every dean, every faculty member could speak with the courage and conviction that Sharon Friesbritt modeled for us earlier today. I also have the luck of getting to work with Sharon at College Park. Absolutely. So to piggyback off of Sean, being able to be fluent, we oftentimes talk about the advantages of being multilingual. And so many of us need to pick up an extra language, and that language is the ability to talk about race. Absolutely, both racial inequality, and the next thing I would say is for people to be able to understand it's not enough for us just to talk about inequality in areas that people are lacking. We need to be able to talk about supremacy. We need to be able to talk about white supremacy. We need to talk about the structural advantage that different populations experience within higher education. They're two sides of the coin. And oftentimes, while it is laudable and important that we are talking about the ways that that we need to be able to bring everyone to the table, we need to be able to challenge and deconstruct why certain people are able to take up so much space at the table. And that conversation absolutely needs to be led, of course, by people of color, but we need to have white people to be multilingual in that area, to have white male college presidents being the ones who are leading conversations about white supremacy. If I go into a room and talk about white supremacy, people are like, all right, okay, right? But if you can go into a room and start talking in it that way, right? People are going to listen in different ways. And then the last thing I would suggest is for colleges and universities to get on board with the idea that this diversity, equity, inclusion work is nonlinear. We oftentimes have this idea that diversity is all about progression, right? So we're gonna get better and then we're gonna get there, right? And then it's gonna be okay, right? It's not like that. It's one step forward, 2 steps back. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. We talked today about how we're seeing things, some of the data from this report should be coming from decades ago and not 2019. And so for us to have really, I think, a mindset of racial realism, right, to understand that structural racism and inequality is not a thing of the past, but it is very much part of our present and everyday reality.
And I think that many of those, you've said many important things, and the coming to terms with race on both sides and thinking about privilege and thinking about supremacy is a really important thing for us to have to get right, and sign me up. So leadership matters, training matters, acknowledgement of the racial realities and the racialism is critically important. Let's talk a little bit about climate and talk about the ways in which, if we're successful, this changes how it feels to be a student, a faculty member, a graduate student on our campuses. What does success look like? Seems to me that I could venture a guess that it would mean that people would be better able to talk about race as a starting point. Is that right?
Yes, and yes, absolutely. But talk about race in multiple venues. Not only have the Black students talking about it on one side and the Latinos speaking about it in another side, or the faculty talking, all the so-called faculty are into it, but how do you begin to move an institution to begin to talk about these issues in multiple venues? How do we use our bully pulpits to continue, and faculty leaders as well? What does our academic senate look like? What does the administration look like? How do we ensure that what Sean is talking about, for example, happens for everyone on campus, just not? And who leads that charge? So for example, when I was a president at a campus, we did this, but we started with the president and the senior cabinet team to start the example, and then started opening it up throughout the campus and having those difficult discussions about white privilege, about the Jewish-Palestine movement, about Black Lives Matter, and making sure that we have our ethnic groups come together, our social groups come together, our students who are the college Republicans come together to be part of the discussion. If we can't do that, then we haven't done the right thing in moving that forward. But I want to add something else, because I want to say, we talk about preparing presidents. But we've got to change the way we're looking for presidents for our colleges and universities.
Yes.
We've got to talk to boards about what diversity matters and different thinking matters, and that you don't have to follow one traditional path in order to be a president. I was the most unlikely person to become college president. I zigzagged throughout my entire university career. And yet, I am happy to say I was okay for 3 college presidents. I came out okay. So how do we talk to boards? How do we talk to search firms to ensure that we have what we need as leaders in order to help our campuses become welcoming to our students?
Yeah, Ted, I was hoping you didn't ask another question because I really want to answer the one that you just posed. So I have a very particular point of view about climate and what it looks like and what it means. While I so very much appreciate the data that are presented in this report, those data tell us some really important and some really horrifying things. But they don't capture for us, perhaps, a set of experiential realities that I think are also worthy of our consideration. So, you know, when I talk with students of color and with faculty of color and staff members of color on campuses, they tell me that they want people to stop calling them the N-word on campus. They want people to stop spray painting racially derogatory terms on the Latino Cultural Center door and on the residence hall doors of Black students. They tell us that, you know, the climate would be significantly improved if there was more attention paid in the curriculum to perspectives and cultural histories beyond those that are white and Eurocentric in nature. Faculty of color especially tell me that, and tell us that, you know, the climate would be drastically improved for us if there were more of us. And if we didn't have to fight so hard to convince our colleagues that there are other people who live in the same bodies as us who also are worthy of being on this faculty, right? You know, this whole notion of racial battle fatigue, having to like always fight for, you know, racial justice and raising the consciousness of our colleagues. You know, those kinds of things would also help to move the needle on, you know, many of the inequities that were so masterfully documented in this report.
And I think that that goes back to the earlier panel and thinking about what kinds of zero tolerance issues need to be in place for that stuff to have consequence.
Can I say a quick word about that? I was on a campus recently that had just completed a no smoking campaign. So it had been a campus where people could smoke cigarettes and other things. And they decided that, okay, we're gonna have a countdown to the last cigarette being smoked on campus. There was a whole like clock and everything, counting it down, and a whole campaign, and there were yard signs around the campus and everything, right? So after the last cigarette was smoked, it became almost instantly normative that if you see somebody even attempting to put a cigarette in their mouth, you go to them and you say, oh no, you can't smoke here. We don't do that here. Imagine if there were that kind of campaign around racism.
Yeah. Julie, you look hard at these issues.
It's a lot of heavy thinking, a lot of food for thought. I'd say, you know, one of the biggest challenges to climate right now, and this is where I also feel like I'm in a time warp sometimes, is the resurgence of explicit acts of racism. And I'm really glad to see the word anti-racism, I think, becoming more prominent. You know, the amazing work of Dr. Kendi and his center to say it's not enough to talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, but we have to add anti-racism to the conversation, to say it's not enough to just say, I'm not a racist, but to say, are you actually doing something? Are you acting? Are you supporting, right? This value. But at the same time, it's troubling because it feels like in some ways the bar is low, right? Because, you know, if it's saying, well, I didn't do blackface, it's like, all right. And so it's, you know, it's like, what year is this? I mean, I teach at Maryland, but I'm a resident of Northern Virginia, and this is just a hard and painful time, you know, and it's gonna have ripple effects. It's gonna have ripple effects for the campus in terms of people saying what's okay and what's excusable, and to have some of the highest levels of power saying, you know, but I'm not going to resign. What's that telling our students? So all of this, I think, you know, lends itself to really complex conversations that I hope campuses will take leadership in addressing point on, and to say, hey, what's going on there? That's not okay. How are we modeling that today? How are we preparing students for citizenship in a diverse democracy? We have to do better.
So I want to change a little bit, and I want to get you guys ready thinking about your questions and comments, and those of you who are online, same same thing. So we've talked, I think, talked about leadership, talked about programming, talked about climate in a variety of different levels. I want to turn us slightly to, apologize for it, sort of the deep state of our higher education institutions. So I think we can think about presidents, and we can think about training, and we can think about venues for there to be conversations. But how much of what we're talking about, both about climate and about the enablers of the data we've seen, how much of it is embedded in places that we wouldn't normally think to go? The registrar's office, the financial aid office. Sean, you and I have talked about alumni associations and how institutions think about bridging the boundary between then and now. Any thoughts about that? I mean, Millie, you really have had those levers in your hands. Such as they are for a college president, by the way.
I do go back to how do we all set the tone, because I want to go back to the former panel. And the question was asked, why are students going to for-profit institutions? And it comes to how people are treated. How people are treated with respect, how people are treated that they have value, that the moment that you walk into an office, that person is seen. We may like it, may not like this, but there are some good for-profits. I happen to have been president of one of them. And every student was treated with the respect that they should have. And when I read all 7,000 every year for 6 years of surveys of students and asking them, why in the world would you come here versus going to the community college or four-year institution in New York State, they would say, because I'm treated with respect, I'm given the tools on how to get there, I am showed how to pass a class, and I see a light at the end of the tunnel. I see that I'm going to get, during their program, it was associate's degree, you have to have one paid internship in the area in which they were studying. And if you were going for a bachelor's degree, you had to have 2 paid internships in the area in which they were studying. All low-income students. And we may not like this, but when students are low income, poor, underrepresented, they want a career and a fulfilling life. We make them fall in love with education. And so that's what the good for-profits are doing. So when you're talking about levers, it is how that administrative assistant doesn't sit there and think that they are doing the student a favor in being there.
Right.
And so that's the climate we're talking about, that they're treated with the amazing skills and the amazing culture and the amazing assets that they're bringing to our institution. And as much as that they're learning, we're learning from them, they're learning from us, and it's co-learning together. That's what students want.
Yeah, let me jump in on this one. I'm of 2 minds about this, and there's a paradox here for me. So on the one hand, I find it just absolutely disgusting, the predatory nature of some for-profit institutions on women of color, most especially. I see these television commercials for them, and almost always it is a black woman or some other woman of color, and it's late at night and she's putting her kid to bed. So the narrative is that she's a single mom and that this is the way that you can get a degree done. And it just seems to me that the marketing is deliberately targeting these women to spend all of this money for these degrees. I think that's wrong. On the other hand, I do think, like Millie just said, that there are some good things that we can learn from those approaches. Our center produces a biennial report on Black male student athletes and racial inequities in Division I college sports. And in it, I suggest, what if admissions officers did what coaches do to find Black students? Coaches don't wait for people to apply to just see who's going to end up on the team. They actively go out and they scout them. They watch videotapes and they use a wider set of metrics beyond SAT scores and grades to determine talent. They actually travel and go and sit in the living rooms with the parents of these young people and seduce them into sending their sons to these institutions to play on these teams, right? They send them text messages, which the NCAA allows. I mean, it's a really robust set of things. But yet I keep hearing admissions officers tell me with a straight face that we can't find any highly qualified black students to admit. Well, what if you did what the coaches do? What if you did even what for-profits do, right? Like imagine if there were public universities that, you know, had really smart marketing campaigns that featured black students and, you know, communicated to them that this is a place where black students belong and will succeed. I think that we would see, you know, a different set of outcomes.
Can I just respond to that real quick?
Yeah.
Real quickly, I will say to you that there are some institutions that are actually doing that. And I'm proud to talk about that as our ASCU institutions. I mean, if you look at, and we talked about community colleges, and I am a strong proponent of community colleges. I graduated from one. But the truth of the matter is that the Lumina Foundation just brought out a report that said that all the new jobs that are being created need some form of higher education, and 70% of them will need bachelor's degrees. We got to make sure that when those students graduate from those community colleges, they come to us. And the ASCU institutions that have 100% of historically black colleges and universities that are showing that they're making progress, or Hispanic serving institutions, or minority serving institutions, that they are taking it, because what happens is we have to change. We have to change, and the institutions have to realize for their viability and their survival, they better change. Because the people of color are here, the browning of America is here, and so it is about change the way you're talking about.
Yeah.
Julie?
Yeah, and Millie's original comments made me think about how, I think in a lot of ways, faculty, especially at, I'd say, research-intensive universities, but I think it oftentimes cuts across other institutional types, I think we're often disincentivized around caring for our students. In the culture and the structure that have been set up with where promotion is based on, you know, publish or perish and then keep publishing or, you know, don't move up. Yeah, there are a lot of things in place that I think build a culture of a lack of caring, right? And students can see through that quite easily. And so my amazing colleague, Kimberly Griffin, has talked about caring as competency. And so when we're thinking of the next generation of the professoriate, right, we oftentimes say teaching, research, and service, right? But how are faculty being able to communicate like that they actually care about their students, that they're invested in their success? And this is what we see oftentimes from what minority serving institutions are doing right and why so many students are doing well at them. So very much so. I think there are structures that are in place that oftentimes are working against the well-being of students of color at our institutions.
So thinking about what the metrics are of institutional success, getting leadership committed to that and to following through, developing programs for people to learn how to do it, and then to drive that into not just the administrative ranks, but the professoriate as well, so that everybody sees this as, sees addressing these numbers as their responsibility with some tools to be able to, do it. Want to turn to you in just a second. Julie, I want to stick with you for a moment. We talked earlier this morning about data disaggregation and the importance of aggregating data. So I'll start with you and work back. You've done a lot of work with the differential experience of Asian Americans in colleges and universities. Can you give us some qualitative sense of how that might play out, thinking about different sorts of data?
Sure. Well, I will put in a plug to look at the full report, right?
Yeah.
And so the summary is wonderful, but the report is where Laurel's awesome team was able to do some more disaggregation of the Asian American community. And not only that, but just analyses after analyses capturing intersectionality between race and gender, race and class, institutional type. The data is cut and sliced and diced in so many ways that it's great. And so you need to look at the full report. But very much disaggregation is critical for our community and our community in so many ways. And it's, to bring it back to the report, it's interesting because On one hand, I think the full report shows the range of experiences that exist within the Asian American population. So we know that certainly by ethnic subgroup, right, educational outcomes vary quite a bit. But it's also important, I think, to understand the historical context of who Asian Americans are, because if you just read the summary, right, and you see in many places it is, when groups are talked about, right, it's like, with the exception of Asians, XYZ, or Asians are on top, et cetera, XYZ. And let me just say it, immigration is not a random sample. Our community has been shaped, we are so diverse, but our community has been shaped, the majority of it, a large section has been shaped by what's known as hyper-selectivity. They didn't just take a random sample of people from Asia in 1965 when they opened the doors. They say, let's cream the crop, right? Let's take people who want to come here for graduate school. So it's a self-selected population that has set so many of the norms and the expectations within this community, which has extended to, right, the model minority myth stereotype and other broader stereotypes. And so understanding that our community is paradoxical. It's, we are made up of, we have tremendous socioeconomic diversity, not just between ethnic subgroups, but within ethnic subgroups. So those Chinese and Korean Americans who you hear are doing well, there are low-income Chinese Americans, there are low-income Korean Americans, and they're facing a lot of challenges. But then on top of that diversity that exists in between ethnic subgroup, you have, a significant population that I would argue does experience structural advantage, right? Because we were brought over because we are highly educated, and that's reproducing itself in different ways, and you can see it in the report when, for the aggregate group, the outcomes look higher.
Sean, how do you think about the desegregation issue?
The same way as Julie.
Excellent, Millie. You want to triple down on that one?
I literally the exact same way. I do have just one thing that I do want to add here is that we often in our work at the center call for the kind of disaggregation among Asian and Asian American and Pacific Islander groups, certainly among Latino, Hispanic, and Latinx groups, but also among Black groups, right? Like, not all Black people are the same. So I appreciated the call earlier for, some disaggregation by sex, which is done, very, very well and responsibly in the report. But also, I would like for us to get to a point where we could do even more sophisticated analyses between, descendants of enslaved African peoples in the U.S. versus Black immigrants. Kimberly Griffin has done some great work that I think others can build on. In the conversation about immigration in our country, sort of the default sort of face of an undocumented American is Mexican American, right? But there are, in fact, Black people who are undocumented Americans.
And Asian, many.
Many. Yes,
Absolutely.
for sure, right? So I would like for us to, get much more particular about which Black people we're talking about in our analyses.
So I just want to add, because I think I agree with both of them wholeheartedly, but it has to come to the local, right? Going back to your institution and knowing which Latino students are you serving? Because we're not all alike.
Right.
Which African Americans or African are you serving? Which Asian Americans? I learned tremendously at Cal State Fullerton because I had a huge Vietnamese population and used my alumni, prominent alumni graduated, to help me get into that community and get to know them. So it goes back to, when we go back to solutions, who do you serve? Who do you serve? And let's get away from the real, this love affair with, the international versus the natives. Let's not forget the native students that we serve. That there may be Latinos, but some that come from Spain and they're skimming the top to come in are not the same as Latinos who were brought up in this country and had to deal with the oppression and the racism and the sexism that we have to deal with. And so it's understanding your student body from where they are to help them where they want to go.
Great. Your turn. Microphones in the usual place. Online accessibility.
Good morning. My name is Catherine Weedle. I am a strategy officer for finance and federal policy at the Lumina Foundation. So there are quite a few folks in the room and on the live stream that do policy-based research. And quite often, publishing reports and briefs, there's not much about campus climate. And this is also for you, Ted, as a former undersecretary. First, is there a role for the federal government to hold institutions accountable for their campus climates, especially considering that hate speech is also legally protected speech? And if there is a role, what are the levers that policymakers can pull to hold institutions accountable?
She said Ted.
She did say Ted.
She said Ted.
I'm passing the buck.
Well, Kat, I have, Dr. Weedle, I have one response, and it's sort of a roundabout response, if you will. When we created the National Assessment of Collegiate Campus Climates, our big national quantitative survey, the way that we thought about the implications for policymakers is that we have to connect campus climate to student success. Right. And as policy groups and accreditors and others are attempting to hold institutions accountable for their performance on student success metrics, that they have to understand that this is a part of that formula. How students differently experience the institution, produces, or at least is a part of the production of, the kinds of inequities that we see. So I think that with more data and helping people understand that these data affect student success outcomes, could be one way to get at policy and governance and accreditation audiences.
And I will say that Board of Trustees members, especially at state comprehensive universities, are holding presidents accountable, not only for student success in the general, but student success broken out by race and gender. And so that's happening at state colleges and universities that I represent.
I think what I'll just add, what Sean said, I think, is a really important link that probably lots hasn't changed about those numbers. Some things have changed. I do think that we now do understand at a deeper level that issues of climate, issues of identity are important in some of those outcome measures, whether those are persistence rates, completion rates, student success rates in the institutions in terms of major choice. And so I think if there is a role for state and federal governments, it is to focus on disaggregated outcomes and to get institutions into the game of making climate be a positive force there.
Good morning. I'm Isaac Egbeshinoy. I'm an education designer at Education Design Lab here in Washington. My question, we talk a lot about the things that institutions should start doing. I'm curious if you all have any opinions regarding things that institutions should stop doing right away in terms of starting to make some movement towards addressing some of the data that's been presented today.
There are so many things. There are so many things that I can go through to begin with. It's really looking at all your policies on what's setting up those barriers from stopping students. Let me give you one very simple one. Dropping students from their schedule of classes because they owe $50.
Right.
Starting to look at policies like that. Another very simple one, the time that they have to register and when they register and how they register with their changing lives. The way we look at schedules, for example. I worked at an institution that we completely changed the schedule, and that was before I was a president, because we knew that they were mostly women. They were taking their children to the school next door, had to drop off their children at 8:30 in the morning, and we were starting classes at 8. That was not going to work for them. So all of these policies that are actual barriers to the students when you know them, to start to help them to come in. How we recruit, right? That's the other thing. Do we recruit in the language of the people of which you are trying to recruit? Do you educate the families as to why your institution is a welcoming institution? May that be in Spanish or Vietnamese or whatever language it is that you have in your neighborhood. And so those are the things that an institution has to think deeply about, their policies and procedures that are barriers to students entering, being retained, and graduating.
I'll, in the interest of time, give you just two because I really could go on all day long in response. Two, one, stop skirting the race question. Again, this is a reinforcement of an earlier point. You can't do racial equity if you can't talk about race. There's that. Secondly, stop doing the exact same thing that you did a whole generation ago to search for faculty. Simply putting an ad in the Chronicle, for example, and like, oh, we're just gonna like hire whoever applies, is not the most strategic way to go about diversifying the faculty. You have to rewrite job descriptions to reinforce a serious commitment to equity, diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism. You have to take more proactive approaches to going to where people of color are, to diverse pool. But yeah, you got to stop doing the same thing that you did before because you're going to almost be guaranteed to get what you've always gotten.
Because that just reinforces the privilege.
Right.
To do it the old way.
Right.
Yeah, I would say stop acting like the campus is a race-neutral space. Stop thinking about, or stop acting like the inequality that divides, and shapes so much of where students go to college, right? That shapes students' lives so much before they come to college. Stop acting like that inequality ends once students are on the college campus. That inequality just continues to shape the college campus. So I'd say stop, I don't want to say double negative, stop not paying attention to it. Start paying attention, right, to that inequality and absolutely everything that's been said.
Great question, and we could do a whole nother panel just on that. Please.
Hi, CJ Powell, Higher Education Program Analyst at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. I'm curious as to how you all think campus leaders should respond to student activism on campus, whether it be boards or campus administrators.
Embrace them, listen to them, be part of it when it's supposed to be. Marching to the police station, and as my Vice President for Student Affairs did with the group from Black Lives Matter, and be able to do that without being concerned, being able to bring them in and have those discussions on their needs as to what's happening with them, and figure out how we help them as administrators, and have the campus help them as administrators. We opened the first, at the CSU Fullerton, we opened the first Dreamer Center. Having that Dreamer Center, and yes, it was not only Hispanics, it was a whole bunch of individuals, but also providing them the resources that they need in order for those DACA students to be able to deal with some really difficult climate.
I would say to appreciate them, what we know historically is that the most fundamental and enduring changes in the history of American higher education as it pertains to people of color were born of student protests.
That's right.
So we are indebted, in fact, to activists because they make our campuses better. They make us do right by them in ways that otherwise, without their courageous demonstrations, we probably wouldn't, right? So yeah, we gotta love them and appreciate them.
Yeah. I would also add to the list, look out for their well-being, right? Oftentimes these students are very vulnerable to burnout, their grade suffering, things like that. So make sure that there are support structures to help them also just be students, which is why they came to college. And also related to that, right? Having people do their jobs. So the people who are paid to do this type of work versus having students be the ones who are primarily bearing that burden, right? So educating yourself so students don't have to always be constantly educating you.
Nice, good, thanks. Please.
Hi, Janan Batar, GRA at ACE and UCLA, doctoral candidate in higher education.
As we spend the day discussing race and ethnicity, Cecilia Reyes-Aguilar brought to our attention the invisibility of many of our students on the margins. And as an Arab American, a Palestinian American, a Muslim American, I often find myself invisible. So to our esteemed panel, how does higher education research and institutional reliance on the US Census categories of race and ethnicity limit our ways to think in new thoughts, new ways, and intentionally render some people of color invisible?
You know, so this is like the weirdest, like most coincidental thing. I only slept 2.5 hours last night because I got in late, body was on West Coast time, couldn't get to sleep. So, you know, like I'm laying in bed in my hotel thinking about like what's next for our center and what are we not doing. And, you know, I was thinking about a member of our staff who is Armenian. And, you know, I'm thinking about sort of the erasure of Armenians in conversations like this. I don't know that I necessarily have the answer to your question other than, yeah, we have to be much more expansive in our consideration of people's, you know, racialized experiences and think beyond, you know, sort of these common data sets from the federal government and other places to be much more inclusive. But seriously, I swear, like I was just thinking about, yeah, we need to do something about Armenians, given that there's so many Armenians in Los Angeles, and yeah, that. So yes, we need that.
Can I throw one in? So I didn't get a chance to answer Oliver's question about student unit record. Yes, is the short answer. And I think we need to become ever more sophisticated, and we can't depend on the federal government or any other single entity to be as flexible as our categories of identity are becoming. And so it's gonna be complicated, but I think we need to start with an inclusive and expansive definition rather than an exclusive and narrow definition. So, please.
Hi.
And we're coming up close on the speed round, so.
My name is Anthony Walsh. I'm here with the Century Foundation.
Yep.
I have a question on the climate and inclusivity. How much of that also plays into Greek life on campuses, and how inclusive, you know, that can be? I was just talking with a fellow person of color the other day about how their freshman year, a bunch of people on their floor got together to go out and eat and discuss Greek life, and not a single person of color on that floor was invited. And when they later found out why, it was just because the thought of those people was just that, you know, these people weren't going to be included into that, you know, segment of the culture anyway, or campus society anyway. So why even invite those kind of people? And that hurt, you know, this individual. Obviously, it made them, you know, not really want to be a part of that school or that campus. And like that is a story that I'm sure rings true with many people of color. So how can campuses, policymakers, anybody deal with that portion of inclusivity on college campuses?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, sort of when we were talking about the stop lists, I would say stop supporting spaces that are known to actively encourage the perpetuation of racism, right? And we have research, right, that shows that after spending several years in historically white fraternities, that those students were more likely to oppose interracial marriage. They had higher rates of symbolic racism. And so very much.
Let's not forget sexual violence.
Yeah, and and just adding to the list.
And let's not forget blackface.
Yes,
Right.
yes.
Or Mexican hats.
Yes,
Right.
yes. And so the list is long. And so very much, I mean, I think when we talk about what are spaces of whiteness on campus, very much Greek life is a huge one.
And what is the responsibility of an administration to work with Greek life and going through what Sean talked about in education and educating people about discussions of race, and what's our role in stopping that kind of behavior, and also learning from those institutions that have actually stopped Greek life because of these acts that have happened, and how do we use them as role models for other campuses throughout the country?
Can I, and Sean, do you want to, okay, so what Millie just said, I think as we're coming out of this, I think the next phase of our conversations, we've talked about a lot of things and we'll continue to talk about a lot of things, about things institutions can do that are bold, things institutions can do that are brave, that encourage courage in others. And I think we need to assemble the stories. We need to assemble the ideas of institutions that are, whether it's tackling Greek life or including a better literacy around race in their institutions, so that we can begin to learn from those as a community in sustained ways, so that we aren't looking at these numbers when we do it again in a year or 2 years, whatever it is. Okay, so please.
Hi, my name is Jeff Cannon. I'm with United Opt-Out. As I was listening, this question may be better suited for the last panel, but looking at universities from Craig Stephen Wilder's Ebony and Ivy or Abraham Kennedy's Stamped from the Beginning as institutions of white supremacy, or the basic holders of white supremacy in society. So when we talk about, well, maybe if we just got rid of a little bit of Greek life, or maybe if we just got more data analytics, or maybe if we increase the ethnic populations of different universities, or didn't use Asians as the model minority, it's sort of like moving the chairs around on the Titanic. Mm-hmm. And I'm going back to a statement that one of my sheroes, Audre Lorde, said very clearly: the master's tools will never be used to dismantle the master's house. So when we share and come to these conferences about race and ethnicity, you know, the little tweaking, we've already known for how long that's not going to work. So we need major shifts in our society about what is white supremacy, just getting rid of blackface. I mean, we went back into the yearbook of my undergrad university, and we just showed years and years and years and years of blackface. It's not as though they didn't know it wasn't racist. I mean, they knew and they didn't care. So, yeah.
Yeah, I got you on this one. So I'm writing a book, Race Matters in College. The first chapter of the book, the first chapter is titled Born Racist. And it is about how higher education as an enterprise was racist from the start. It was exclusionary from the start, right? And that people of color have been excluded far, far, far longer than we've been included in any meaningful or symbolic way. So when we work with presidents and other leaders in our USC Equity Institutes, we actually teach them about the history, the racial history of American higher education. Many of them are shocked. They didn't know any of these things, right? Or they don't, I believe them. I don't think they're pretending to be surprised, right? Like, no one ever helped them understand how it was white people and only white people who determine what a college is, right, how it functions, right, what its curriculum is, how it's going to look architecturally, what its culture is going to be, what its policies will be for determining entry for students as well as for people who work there. So I think that, you know, part of our responsibility right now is to, again, at least for us, to help leaders understand that this is bigger than you and what you're doing on your campus right now, that you're a part of a larger ecosystem of racial oppression and racial violence, right? And that is super helpful in helping people to understand, you know, sort of their real point of entry and starting to, you know, bring about structural change.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Sean. Please.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Marissa Mahoney. I'm with the Economic Club of Washington, D.C. We have an education program where we offer scholarships to graduates of D.C. public schools, and we partner with our members who are corporate executives and global and regional business leaders to provide internships and mentoring for our students. I'd love to get the panel's perspective on how you see the role of the business community and what the business community can do to help mitigate some of these negative trends, as well as help close some of these gaps. What have you seen that has worked, and what would you like to see more of? Thank you.
So I think we're at a time now that we have to be in partnership in partnerships in many ways. I think businesses have to have a responsibility in helping us to figure out where our students are going to go, but also using their dollars to help us to get our students to move on. They have a responsibility for their communities, and there are many companies within those communities that are sitting at the table with some campuses and talking about what they see is needed. You know, what AAC and you did their research on what employers want. What they want is what we're teaching. We just got to make sure that our students of color are getting it, that they're entrepreneurs, that they're innovators, that they're critical thinkers, that they can communicate well. But we have to be not so insular in higher ed and put people around the table. Put not only the businesses, our community-based organizations, our families around the table, our economic development individuals around the table to help lift our communities. Because at the end of the day, this is, yes, it is a private good for the students we are educating and the generations after it, but it's also a public good. It's a public good for our communities because our students want to give back to those communities. So how do we bring people to the table and work real partnerships in moving this forward?
Please.
Sure. Rosa Garcia, Center for Law and Social Policy. There's been a lot of discussion about being bold in 2019. And so what I wanted to hear from the panel, and I haven't heard as much discussion about these two populations, which is low-income, non-traditional students and undocumented immigrant youth. We're having this national debate here, this debate here in Washington about DACA and sort of the future of undocumented immigrant youth. So I wanted to know, what are some of those bold steps that college leaders and institutions can take to better serve these students?
Speaking for ASCU institutions, we already have pushed the agenda in Washington, and so has ACE, regarding the DACA situation and how it has to be solved. And what the bold steps are doing what we're doing for our students on our campuses. The bold steps are being there for those families that are afraid. The bold steps is speaking up, and not because we're the ones that can speak up and they cannot. And have the community talk to the legislators in our states and in our cities to be that voice, and also to find prominent alumni that will be able to speak up, that they will listen to, because they'll talk to us, but sometimes, oh, you're self-interested. But when you get one of those prominent alums that happen to be from a different party who are supporting it because they need these individuals who are great workers and are contributing to this country to speak up, they listen. But it has to be concerted, it has to be systemic, and it has to be continuous.
I'll say that for me, I deliberately haven't talked about lower income students in this conversation because a lot of times there's a way that race gets erased.
Yep.
And, like poverty is used as a proxy for race. I very much appreciate that this conversation has been explicitly racialized. That doesn't mean that, talking about low-income students is unimportant. I certainly don't mean to suggest that. And
Low-income students who are also students of color,
Sure.
who are also non-traditional students, so who basically fall into both of those categories.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Yes, we need to do more of that. Dare I say that some of that is done in the full report. What I will also say, though, about undocumented Americans, I can appreciate a good presidential statement or a good statement from a consortium of presidents. I think that's really good. But I do think that we need more presidential ambassadors to use their platforms to speak very boldly and publicly in defense of undocumented Americans. A lot of times, college presidents and provosts especially will say to me, I'm so angry about this thing that happened on my campus, or I'm so angry with what's happening in Washington around these things. And I'm like, well, yeah, you need to say that not to me. You need to say that to a wide audience of people, not. If you're as angry as you're saying that you are, Yeah, why don't we hear you saying that, publicly? I think we need more
You heard
of
me?
that. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
You heard me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good morning. I appreciate the insight that's been provided at this point. My name is Cristobal Rodriguez. I'm an associate professor and director of graduate studies at Howard University up the street. The question, and really something for us to think about when it comes to addressing and advocating for matters around race, is that we tend to be very insular within our own advocacy efforts in our own communities. The challenge for us to think about is how do we build strategic, powerful coalitions on our campuses? And I don't think we're doing that enough. And there's histories of those coalition efforts across time that have been over time. Even going back to early movements of student movements in the 60s, we know those are important, have been powerful, but I don't think we've done that enough. And what insight might you provide strategically for us to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't have anything off the top of my head in terms of what could, but I agree with you that those social movements, right, have largely been, we can't do this work in isolation. And so very much thinking of, from the beginning, I said, my words can only go so far. If a white male says them, they will reach different audiences. And so building those relationships, building those partnerships behind the scenes, absolutely.
And Melly, I think this goes to your point about NGOs and other organizations, community-based organizations, labor unions, others with whom we ought to be working from the campus space.
Right. It's that coalition, it's also within the campus, and how do we set that up with all our different groups? Because we have lots of groups on campus. How do we bring them around the table? How do we set up those coalitions so that they are not only working together, but learning from each other so that we don't have them segregated into their groups? And the structures and how we set up those structures on our campuses so that we facilitate them to work together is extremely important.
Last word.
I'll be quick. My name is Kathleen. I'm a public policy grad student at Georgetown, and I'm thinking about how the federal government could play a role. So this year they're reauthorizing the Higher Education Act, and there's lots of different discussions around this act, but I'm curious specifically, what do you see as being helpful in this act around racial equity, racial justice on college campuses? I know, it's a hard question to finish
Time's
with.
up. So it's a longer set of conversations, but I think the short of it is that federal policy is a really blunt instrument, and these are not blunt instrument problems. And I think if you think about the conversation that we've had and the conversation of the first panel, I think going back to that first panel, there is and some of Sandy's comments is really to try to hold the line, to keep federal legislation or state legislation from changing the incentives in such a way that might upset some of the gains that we've already seen and prevent institutions from doing what they need to implement the kind of work that we've been talking about today. So that sounds a little bit negative and defensive, but I think it is.
But it is about educating. We're educators. We work at institutions that we should be educating individuals of what it means to be an inclusive environment. We need to be educating people to see what this country has become now and what it will become in the future. We need to educate people that if we don't educate this new majority, what will happen not only to them, but to their communities and to the viability and vitality of this nation. And if we're not doing that, we in higher education are failing.
I will also add that I am a huge proponent of race-conscious policymaking. Perhaps yours is different. I've not looked at it. But most graduate programs that prepare people who go on to work in policy spaces don't include very much in the curriculum about racism, about structural racism, about communities of color, and so on. And then those people go into policy spaces, having been prepared in a race-neutral way to make policy. So I think that we have to teach people who are engaged in policy making, again, how to raise race questions, and also how to think structurally about how to address racial inequities when we see them in housing, in economics, education, and so on.
I will agree that, federal legislation is a blunt instrument. There are many limitations in terms of what it can and can do. But at the same time, through federal legislation, I have seen the legitimization, right? So being able, when policy actually takes race into account, even if the money attached to that is not big, it can mean a lot for a community. So I'm thinking of my own community with ANAPCs, Asian American and Pacific Islander serving institutions, which is something we never thought would be a reality. And while it only funds a small number of institutions, that recognition from the federal government, I think, goes a long way. And so likewise, with funding for minority serving institutions, with race-conscious policymaking, there is more potential that might be out there with the next generation of policymakers.
Thank you.
Good, thanks. Probably a good spot for us to end on. Any last words for the good of the order? Okay. We're good, thank you. Thanks to the panel.
So it might be easier for me to give some closing remarks with all of you up here, because I stand between you and lunch and the rest of your day and whatnot. But I, first and foremost, want to thank everybody in this room. This was a diverse group of prospective students. I see you. I love that you're here. I love that all of our peer association folks came out, other nonprofits, think tanks, those of you that are advocating regularly. I appreciate you being here. I also want to recognize Elizabeth Howard on my team, who I didn't give a shout out earlier. She's sitting right over there with John, Morgan, Holly, and Liz. Thank you again for all of your work. I want to obviously thank the panels. We raised a lot of issues today: climate, poverty, racism, white supremacy, policies, funding, culture, leadership. Leadership matters tremendously. I'm glad that we kept going there. This conversation really has exceeded my expectations. And the reason we are all so passionate about this is because we know the promise of higher education. That is why we are frustrated, angry, our hearts are heavy, as Sharon said, because we know that power, and our communities know even more about the power of it to really move them up in ways that other systems in this country don't. And I just want to put that out there because that is really why we're at the table. And I want to really emphasize what Millie said about this being a public good and not only a private one. And I think our communities appreciate that perhaps more than most. So we talked a lot about gaps today. The heavy heart again, looking at Sharon. There are bright spots. There are bright spots. They are in the report. The fact that more students of color are going on to graduate school, to me, is a huge one. There are a lot of institutions doing incredible work. We need to get the institutions that are doing less incredible work to pay attention to those. And ACE has a role in that, and we will be taking that role seriously. And finally, we have a role in understanding what it means to be an equity-minded leader. And as a presidential association, we will be exploring that topic in depth with scholars, with many around the table, all the voices that we said we need. And that's a commitment that I want to make to you today. So thank you again for coming out. I am really, really pleased with what we accomplished today. And please give us feedback and go to that website. All right, thanks everyone.